Step back into frontier history and discover how mountain men built log cabins from scratch, using only axes, sweat, and survival skills. From felling trees to raising smoky chimneys, this story reveals grit, resilience, and ingenuity. So relax, unwind, and let this calm narration guide you through the rugged life of pioneer survival. When you imagine the life of a mountain man, you probably picture a bearded figure trudging through snow with a rifle slung over his shoulder, maybe chewing on a strip of jerky while scanning the horizon for game. You might imagine buckskin clothes, a wolf pelt draped around his shoulders, and a look in his eyes that says, "I've eaten more squirrels this week than you've eaten hot meals in your life." What you might not immediately think about is where this guy goes at night, because even the toughest mountain men had to deal with the most basic human problem: shelter. You can only sleep under the stars so long before rain soaks your bedding, snow tries to smother you, and mosquitoes decide you're their all-you-can-eat buffet, which leads to the big question: why did mountain men go through the back-breaking, sweat-drenched, blister-inducing effort of building cabins from scratch, when they could have just thrown up a tent or leaned some branches against a tree? At first glance, it seems kind of absurd. Picture it: you're in the wilderness with nothing but your tools, your grit, and maybe a mule if you're lucky. Trees stretch in every direction, rivers run cold, the wind slices through the valley. You could set up a lean-to in an afternoon with a little effort, or string up a canvas tent if you got one tucked away. Quick, easy, no log dragging, no blistered hands, no smashed toes from dropping timber on your feet. But mountain men weren't looking for quick and easy. They were looking for something that could last. Because the wilderness didn't just throw one bad night at you. It threw months of cold, storms that rattled the trees, and winters that laughed at flimsy shelters. A tent was fine if you were traveling light and moving every day. A lean-to was good if you only needed a spot for a single hunt. But if you wanted to winter in one place, if you wanted a base camp, if you wanted any shot at surviving long stretches of isolation, you needed 4 walls and a roof that could stand up to the elements. You needed a cabin. And here's the kicker: cabins weren't just about survival. They were about psychology. Imagine living out in the mountains for weeks, maybe months, with nothing but sky over your head and predators prowling in the dark. You want more than just a tarp flapping in the wind. You want something that feels like a home, even if it's a crude box of logs with a smoke-belching chimney. You want the solid thunk of a door shutting against the night. You want the knowledge that if a blizzard rolls in, you won't wake up buried alive in snow. Cabins weren't pretty, and they weren't comfortable by modern standards, but they gave mountain men something priceless: peace of mind. Of course, peace of mind came at a cost. Building a cabin from scratch in the wilderness was no small task. This wasn't a weekend DIY project with a nail gun and a Home Depot lumber cart. This was weeks of chopping trees, shaping logs, stacking walls, and wrestling with mud, clay, and moss to fill in the gaps. Every beam had to be cut by hand. Every notch had to be hacked out with an axe. Every roof beam had to be hoisted with nothing but brute strength and maybe the help of a few fellow trappers if you were lucky enough to have company. Sweat froze on your face in winter, blood blistered your palms, and one mistake could send a log rolling down a hillside to smash everything you'd already built. And yet, mountain men kept doing it, because they knew the payoff. A cabin meant stability, security, and the ability to last more than a season in one place. There's also the matter of permanence. A tent could blow away, a lean-to could rot or collapse, but a cabin was a mark on the land. It was a statement that said, "I'm here. This is my spot. This valley, this river bend, this patch of wilderness. I claim it." Even if no one else came by for months, the cabin was a symbol of survival. proof that a man could carve order out of chaos. For mountain men, many of whom lived solitary lives far from civilization, that kind of permanence mattered. It gave them roots in a place where everything else was transient. And sometimes cabins became more than just homes. They became trading posts, meeting spots, or shelters for travelers who stumbled through the same territory. One man's sweat-built cabin could end up saving another man's life. The choice to build cabins also came down to pure necessity. The mountains weren't forgiving. Winters could drop temperatures low enough to freeze rivers solid. Snow piled up feet deep. Winds howled like banshees, rattling trees until branches cracked and fell. In that kind of environment, flimsy shelters were recipes for frostbite and death. Cabins, with their thick log walls, offered insulation. They trapped heat from fireplaces and stoves, giving mountain men at least a fighting chance against the cold. Sure, smoke often filled the room and dirt floors turned to mud, but it was better than freezing to death in a canvas tent that tore open in the first snowstorm. The cabin was the line between life and death, comfort and misery, survival and surrender. But if we really want to understand the big question, why cabins, we need to step back and look at the broader culture of frontier life. For mountain men, building a cabin wasn't just a chore. It was a rite of passage. It was a test of manhood, resilience, and skill. Anyone could light a fire. Anyone could throw together a temporary lean-to. But to build a cabin from scratch, that took planning, endurance, and a stubborn refusal to quit. Cabins became badges of honor. They were the physical proof of self-reliance, the wooden monuments to the idea that a single person could walk into the wilderness and make a home with nothing but an axe, a saw, and willpower. And yet, let's not romanticize it too much. Building cabins was hard, really hard. Mountain men had to contend with accidents, exhaustion, and sheer monotony. Hours upon hours of chopping, dragging, stacking, and mud smearing. Days when the wind blew so hard you could barely see. Nights when wolves howled just outside the flickering light of your fire. You'd start to wonder if it was all worth it, if maybe a tent wasn't such a bad idea after all. But then the walls rose higher, the roof went on, the chimney smoked, and suddenly you had something that felt permanent, a boxy little fortress against the wild. That feeling of achievement kept them going. From a modern perspective, it's almost impossible to wrap our heads around the grit it took. Today, if your house gets cold, you turn up the thermostat. If your roof leaks, you call a contractor. If you want to build something, you have power tools, truck deliveries, and online tutorials. For mountain men, the frontier was a constant lesson in improvisation. No instruction manuals, no second chances, just raw survival. That's why the big question has a simple answer. Tents and lean-tos were fine for travelers, but cabins were for survivors. Mountain men built cabins because they had to, because the wilderness demanded it, and because the cabin wasn't just shelter. It was sanity, stability, and survival carved out of the trees. So the next time you see a log cabin, whether it's a roadside tourist attraction or a romantic getaway, remember what it really meant. It wasn't cozy decor or rustic chic. It was weeks of sweat, months of planning, and the difference between life and death. Mountain men built cabins, not because it was easy, but because nothing else could withstand the mountain's brutal indifference. They traded blood and muscle for four walls and a roof, and in doing so, proved that even in the wildest wilderness, humans could carve out a home. And that's the big question answered. Why cabins? Because anything less was a gamble with nature, and mountain men weren't gamblers. They were builders, fighters, and survivors who understood that sometimes the only way to win against the wild is to stack one log on top of another until you've built yourself a fortress of grit. Before a single tree was cut or a single log dragged through the mud, mountain men had to answer the question that decided whether their cabin would keep them alive or slowly kill them. Where do you put the thing? Cabin location wasn't random. You didn't just wander into a clearing, grunt, looks good enough, and start chopping. Choosing the wrong spot could turn your carefully built log fortress into a drafty icebox, a soggy swamp pit, or even a wolf highway. Pick too low and you'd drown in spring floods. Pick too high and the wind would rip the roof off before your first winter stew finished cooking. Finding the perfect spot was the invisible skill of mountain men, as important as the axe or the rifle, because survival started long before the first log hit the ground. The first rule was water. A cabin without a water source nearby was doomed. You couldn't just pop down to a faucet or order bottled water in the 1820s Rockies. You needed a stream, a spring, or a river, something you could walk to in minutes. But here's the catch. Too close, and you were in trouble. Build your cabin right on a riverbank, and you'd wake up one morning with the floor underwater and your firewood floating away. Build it beside a swampy pond, and you'd be eaten alive by mosquitoes and maybe even poisoned by stagnant water. Mountain men learned to strike a balance, close enough to haul buckets without cursing every step, far enough that floods and pests didn't turn the cabin into a nightmare. A cold, clear spring on higher ground was a jackpot. If you found one bubbling from the rocks, you were practically blessed. The second rule was sun. It sounds simple, but where the sunlight hit could make or break you. Cabins built facing north stayed dark and cold, with snow piled high in front, like nature's cruel joke. A south-facing cabin, on the other hand, caught the sun's warmth in winter, helping melt snow and keeping the inside less bone-chilling. Morning light through the doorway could lift morale after a night of howling wind. Mountain men weren't architects with fancy blueprints, but they knew enough to watch the way shadows stretched, to notice how the sun rose and set over ridges, and to aim their doors toward the warmth. In a world where every degree of heat mattered, a cabin aligned wrong could shave weeks off your survival chances. Then came wind. The mountains didn't blow gentle breezes. They screamed with gales that could topple trees and send branches crashing like spears. If you built your cabin in a wind corridor, you'd spend every night listening to the roof groan and the walls whistle. If you built on the wrong side of a hill, snowdrifts would bury your door until you were trapped inside, clawing your way out like a hibernating bear. Smart mountain men scouted ridges, valleys, and tree lines, learning where the wind funneled and where it broke. A cabin tucked behind a stand of trees, shielded from the harshest gusts, stayed warmer and safer. Shelter from the wind wasn't just comfort. It was protection against frostbite and starvation. Drainage was another silent killer. The wilderness loved nothing more than teaching lessons with mud. If you built your cabin in a low hollow because it looked cozy, spring rains would turn the floor into a swamp. Mud seeped up through the dirt, firewood rotted, and your boots squelched with every step. Cabins needed slightly higher ground, a gentle slope where water drained away instead of pooling. Mountain men scanned the soil, noticed where grass grew thick or thin, watched how rainwater trickled after storms. It wasn't luck, it was observation, the difference between living in a house or living in a puddle. Another factor was resources. You could have the best sun, water, and wind protection, but if your cabin site was miles from decent timber, you were out of luck. Dragging logs uphill for half a day wasn't just exhausting, it was impossible to sustain. The best cabin sites had trees close enough to chop and drag by hand, preferably straight pines or cedars that stacked well, and it wasn't just logs. You needed stones for the chimney, clay or mud for chinking, grass or bark for roofing, and plenty of firewood for the long winter. Smart mountain men chose spots where resources clustered. That way, you spent less time hauling and more time building. Predators and pests also shaped decisions. You didn't want to build right next to a bear's favorite berry patch or on a game trail that wolves prowled at night. Signs like scat, claw marks, and trampled paths were warnings. Mountain men learned to read the land the way modern people read street signs. A cabin site that looked safe at first glance might turn out to be a wildlife superhighway, and while a sturdy cabin could keep most predators out, it was still better to avoid being surrounded by nightly visitors scratching at the logs. Then there was proximity to trails. Mountain men valued isolation, but too much isolation meant no trading, no news, and no rescue if something went wrong. A cabin too deep in the wilderness left you cut off. A cabin too close to a major trail or river crossing left you exposed to raiders, rival trappers, or anyone passing through who wanted what you had. The trick was balance, far enough to avoid constant visitors, close enough to reach trading posts or rendezvous points when the season demanded. A well-placed cabin was both fortress and outpost, private but not invisible. Some choices also came down to simple gut feeling. Mountain men spent days scouting, sleeping under the stars, and watching the land. They learned to listen, not just to the wind and water, but to instincts honed by trial and error. A sight might feel wrong because of how cold the air sank at night, or how shadows stretched across it, or how damp the ground stayed even in dry weather. Another sight might just feel right, solid, sheltered, practical. And when you're building a cabin that's supposed to keep you alive for months, sometimes gut instinct was as important as geometry. Choosing the wrong spot could be fatal. Mountain men told stories of cabins that collapsed from snowdrifts, cabins flooded waist-deep in spring, cabins abandoned because the smoke never cleared and choked the inhabitants. A bad site meant wasted weeks of work, wasted strength, and sometimes even death when winter came. Choosing the right spot, on the other hand, meant warmth, security, and a fighting chance. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was survival engineering at its finest. So why did mountain men obsess over location? Because they had to. Every choice was a gamble against nature, and the house always won if you cut corners. A tent or lean-to could be slapped down anywhere. A cabin was different. It was commitment. It was an announcement that said, "I will survive here." And survival hinged on getting the site right before you laid the first log. In the end, the perfect cabin site was never perfect. It was a compromise between water and wind, sun and slope, solitude and access. It was a patch of earth chosen with care, tested by instinct, and hardened by necessity. And when the first snow fell, when the wolves howled, and when the rivers froze solid, mountain men knew their survival didn't just depend on how well they stacked logs. It depended on whether they had chosen the right place to put them. When it came time to actually build, the mountain man had no lumber yard, no stack of neatly milled boards waiting in piles, no delivery truck pulling up with pre-cut beams. Timber time meant exactly that. The forest was your lumber yard, and every tree standing tall was a potential wall, roof, or support beam. The only problem? Those trees didn't exactly volunteer. You had to pick them, fell them, strip them, drag them, and somehow convince them to stop being trees and start being a cabin. It was backbreaking, blister-raising, sweat-drenched work, and if you picked the wrong wood, your cabin would repay you with sagging walls, bug infestations, or worse, collapse. Choosing the right logs was as important as swinging the axe. Not all wood was created equal. Mountain men quickly learned which trees were worth the swing and which ones were a waste of sweat. Straight, tall pines were the gold standard. They grew long and uniform, which meant fewer knots, easier stacking, and less headache when it came to notching corners. Fir and spruce were also favorites, especially in colder climates, because they split cleaner and stacked neatly. Cedar was prized for its natural resistance to rot and bugs, plus it smelled like the forest itself had your back. Aspen and poplar sometimes worked too, but their softness made them less ideal for long-term sturdiness. Hardwood trees like oak or hickory were strong, yes, but they were also stubborn, dense, and exhausting to chop, drag, and shape. A lone mountain man with a dull axe didn't want to wrestle with 100 hardwood logs unless he was in the mood to test how quickly blisters could cover his hands. The art of picking timber wasn't just about species, though. It was about shape. A twisted or gnarled tree was a nightmare. Every log in a cabin needed to line up with its neighbors, and one bad log could leave gaps wide enough for a winter draft to blow in like a knife. Straight trunks, clean lines, minimal branches, those were the dream. Mountain men walked among the trees with a practiced eye, scanning for candidates, tapping trunks with the handle of an axe to hear the solid ring of good wood. The forest was full of trees, but only a fraction were cabin-worthy. And then came the question of green wood. Freshly cut logs, still wet with sap, were easier to fell and shape. They were softer under the axe, more cooperative under the saw. But there was a catch. Green wood shrank as it dried. If you built your cabin entirely out of fresh-cut logs, the walls would settle, gaps would open, and the whole thing could warp into a drafty mess over the months. Doors jammed, roofs sagged, smoke leaked where it wasn't supposed to. Mountain men who had time sometimes cut timber a season in advance, letting it dry before using it, but more often than not, they didn't have that luxury. When you needed shelter now, you grabbed green wood and accepted that your cabin might creak, settle, and sigh its way through the first winter. Chinking, that mix of moss, mud, clay, or whatever you could find, had to be reapplied as the logs shifted. A cabin was never finished after the last log was laid. It kept changing as the wood dried and aged, a living thing even after the tree was technically dead. Felling trees was its own kind of art. Mountain men stood with axe or saw in hand, judging the lean, the wind, and the space where the tree should fall. A mistake could flatten your camp, or worse, flatten you. Shouts of timber weren't just for fun. They were a survival tactic, a warning that a several thousand-pound tree was about to come crashing down with the kind of force that turned men into pulp. Chopping wasn't quick. A good-sized tree could take hours of steady, rhythmic swings. Each thunk of the axe bit through rings of history, sap spraying, sweat dripping, and muscles aching. In winter, your breath puffed in the air like smoke. In summer, mosquitoes swarmed your face as bark chips flew. A mountain man alone might take down a handful of trees in a day if he pushed himself, then collapse exhausted with little to show but aching arms and a pile of rough logs that still needed stripping and dragging. Stripping bark was more than cosmetic. Left on, bark trapped moisture, bred bugs, and rotted quickly. A cabin made of unstripped logs could become a beetle buffet or a mouldy nightmare within months. So mountain men used draw knives, hatchets, or even just the edge of an axe to peel away bark, exposing the pale wood beneath. In warm weather, the bark sometimes slid off in satisfying sheets. In cold weather, it clung stubbornly, forcing long scraping sessions that left arms sore and tempers short. Stripping was tedious, but it made the difference between a cabin that lasted a season and one that lasted years. Dragging logs into place was another ordeal. Without oxen or horses, a mountain man relied on sheer muscle and crude levers. Logs were rolled, pried, or dragged with ropes over makeshift skids. Sledges worked in snow, but mud made every log feel twice as heavy. Injuries were constant. A misstep meant a crushed foot or broken bone. And yet, one by one, the logs made their way to the building site, forming piles of future walls. Each log represented hours of work, every bead of sweat banked against the promise of warmth and safety. Timber selection also carried strategic thinking. Shorter logs were used for cross walls, longer ones for the main stretch. Thicker logs went on the bottom for stability, thinner ones up top to lighten the load. Crooked logs sometimes became rafters or rough supports, places where perfection mattered less. Nothing went to waste. Even scraps became firewood or chinking tools. Mountain men couldn't afford to be picky beyond the essentials. A cabin wasn't built with architectural symmetry in mind. It was built with what you had, shaped by what the forest gave you. Over time, experienced cabin builders learned to see beyond the tree. They looked at a stand of pines and saw walls. They looked at a cedar grove and saw beams resistant to rot. They looked at an aspen thicket and saw roofing poles. Every swing of the axe turned potential into reality, slowly transforming wilderness into shelter. That transformation wasn't magic. It was sheer human grit, the ability to take something raw and living and reshape it into something protective and enduring. And while timber time was exhausting, it was also a point of pride. Mountain men often bragged about the quality of their cabins, the straightness of their logs, the snugness of their walls. A poorly built cabin was a mark of inexperience. A well-built one meant respect, survival, and sometimes even envy. Cabins told stories. They showed whether a man had chosen good timber, whether he had the patience to notch logs correctly, whether he could wrestle the forest into something livable. Timber wasn't just raw material, it was the test, the measure of whether you had what it took to survive the frontier. So why timber? Why not sticks, rocks, or sod alone? Because logs gave mountain men the balance they needed: strength, insulation, and availability. Trees were everywhere. They were free for the taking, provided you had the endurance to swing the axe. Unlike canvas tents or milled planks, you didn't have to carry them on your back for weeks. You just had to earn them with sweat. Each log carried the memory of the tree it once was, the hours spent felling, stripping, dragging, and stacking. By the time a cabin stood tall, every log had become part of the builder's story. In the end, timber time was the heartbeat of cabin building. It was the grueling, necessary phase that turned ambition into reality. Mountain men built not just with tools, but with choices. The right tree, the right cut, the right placement. Pick poorly, and your cabin rotted, warped, or fell. Pick wisely, and your cabin endured, keeping out the storms, the cold, and the wolves scratching at the walls. Timber was the test of survival, and for those who passed, it became the skeleton of a home, the silent guardian against the wilderness, the proof that even in the harshest mountains, men could carve order from endless trees. If you stripped a mountain man down to his essentials, you wouldn't find much. Maybe a rifle, a knife, some flint for fire, and, most sacred of all, his axe and his saw. These weren't just tools, they were survival itself, the thin line between having a cabin and sleeping under a leaky lean-to, between having firewood stacked high for winter and freezing to death when the first snow fell. An axe and a saw weren't conveniences, they were lifelines. A mountain man without them was as good as dead, or at least doomed to a long season of misery. And because they mattered so much, mountain men treated these tools like family, sharpened them, cared for them, cursed at them, and sometimes risked their lives for them. The axe was the undisputed king. Long before the first tree fell, a mountain man leaned on his axe like a staff, knowing it would soon swing and bite into timber that would become his walls, his roof, his fire. Axes came in different shapes and weights, but the most common for cabin building was the felling axe, a long-handled brute with a broad, razor-sharp head meant to cut across wood grain. With every swing, the blade bit deep, chips flew, and the tree shuddered closer to surrender. The axe wasn't just for felling trees, it was for shaping logs, splitting firewood, carving notches, and sometimes even protection. When wolves or hostile strangers lurked too close, the gleam of an axe head in firelight wasn't just comforting, it was a warning. But the axe wasn't useful if it was dull. A dull axe was a curse, bouncing off logs, glancing dangerously close to shins, and doubling the amount of effort needed. That's why sharpening was almost a ritual. Mountain men carried whetstones or improvised sharpening rocks, grinding edges until the blade could shave hair off an arm. It wasn't vanity, it was survival science. A sharp axe sunk deep, cut clean, and saved energy. And energy was everything. Swinging a dull axe for hours meant exhaustion, blisters, and frustration. Swinging a sharp one meant progress. A man could often be judged by the shine of his axe edge because a neglected tool revealed laziness, and laziness killed faster than wolves. Sharpening wasn't occasional, it was constant. After a day of chopping, a mountain man sat by his fire, pulling the edge across the stone, oiling the metal, checking for chips. If the blade nicked against hidden rocks or twisted knots in the wood, it needed care immediately. Letting damage sit meant weakness at the worst moment. Mountain men often joked, or maybe didn't, that their axes were their best friends. Lose your rifle, and maybe you could trap small game. Lose your knife, and you could whittle with stone. Lose your axe, and your cabin became impossible. Firewood became a nightmare. Life became fragile. The saw was the axe's quieter partner, but no less important. While the axe cut trees down and split them open, the saw tamed them. A good crosscut saw made short work of beams and logs, slicing clean and straight, where an axe would have hacked rough edges. For big logs, two-man saws, those long blades with handles on both ends, were unbeatable. But here's the catch. Most mountain men worked alone. That meant one-man saws, or the lonely grinding effort of doing both ends yourself. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. The saw cut planks for doors, smoothed edges, and trimmed beams for tighter fits. Where the axe provided brute force, the saw gave precision. Together, they were a survival duo, muscle and finesse working hand in hand. Like the axe, the saw needed care. Teeth dulled quickly, especially on tough hardwoods or if grit crept into the cut. Sharpening a saw was trickier than an axe, requiring a file and patience to keep every tooth at the right angle. Mountain men learned quickly that a dull saw was worse than no saw. It stuck, bound, and tore rather than sliced. In winter, when metal grew brittle in the cold, a careless stroke could snap teeth clean off. And unlike axes, which could be reground again and again, saws were harder to repair in the wild. That's why losing one could be catastrophic. A cabin without straight cuts became rickety. A man without a saw burned more energy shaping wood by axe alone. Every tooth in a saw was a little insurance policy against collapse. The relationship mountain men had with these tools bordered on reverence. When they traveled, axes and saws were wrapped in cloth, strapped tightly, guarded as carefully as powder horns. If thieves came calling, they stole furs and rifles first, but a missing axe could leave a man stranded, unable to build or heat. Stories spread of trappers who lost axes in rivers or dropped saws down ravines and nearly starved because they couldn't cut enough wood. Tools were so valuable that sometimes they were traded like currency. A sharp axe worth more than gold in the high mountains where trees were plentiful, but human energy was scarce. Axes and saws weren't only practical, they were symbols. An axe slung over the shoulder marked a man as a builder, not just a wanderer. A saw leaning against a cabin wall was a sign of permanence, proof that someone had invested sweat and skill in the land. When travelers stumbled across abandoned cabins, the condition of the tools inside often told the story. Rusted axes meant death or departure. Sharpened ones meant a man might return. Tools outlived their owners, passed down, traded, or scavenged, carrying the weight of past lives in their handles. Handling these tools required rhythm and care. Swing an axe wrong, and it could glance off a log into your leg. Push a saw too fast, and it bound tight, pinching until the blade bent or snapped. Mountain men developed patience, learning to work with the tools instead of against them. Swing, breathe, swing, breathe. The cadence of an axe was almost meditative. Sawing was steady push and pull, a song of teeth biting wood. In a silent wilderness, the sound of chopping or sawing carried far, echoing through valleys, marking the presence of humans among the trees. Sometimes it was the only noise for miles besides the wind and the cry of birds. There was also an artistry to use. Notching logs for corners required precise axe cuts, angled just right to lock wood together. Carving shingles demanded clean saw strokes. Firewood had to be split fine enough to catch flame, but thick enough to last overnight. Each task showed the versatility of these tools. They weren't one-use gadgets. They were extensions of the mountain man's body, as essential as his hands or feet. Even their weight mattered. A felling axe was heavy, often 6 pounds or more, with a long hickory handle. Too heavy, and it wore a man down fast. Too light, and it bounced uselessly. Saws varied, some so long they looked absurd in a single man's hands, others compact enough to strap to a pack. Mountain men chose carefully, balancing strength with portability, because every ounce mattered when you hauled gear over mountains. What made axes and saws even more important was how they fit into the rhythm of seasons. In summer, when the weather was kind, they were tools of construction, raising cabins, fences, and storage racks for food. In fall, they became tools of preparation, cutting cords of firewood for the long winter. In winter, they were lifelines, splitting logs to feed hungry stoves and fireplaces. And in spring, they were tools of repair, reshaping and rebuilding as cabins sagged and warped from snow. The cycle never ended, and neither did the need for sharp steel. And while mountain men could improvise many things, clothes from hides, rope from plant fibers, containers from bark, axes and saws couldn't be replaced with wilderness hacks. You could make a stone axe, sure, but it shattered quickly and dulled faster than you could sharpen it. Metal was magic, forged elsewhere, carried into the mountains, and protected fiercely. A man without his axe and saw wasn't just underprepared, he was naked against the wilderness. That's why tools were treated with the same seriousness as food and rifles. Without them, everything else collapsed. So why were axes and saws life or death? Because they were the heartbeat of frontier survival. They carved homes, cut fuel, shaped defenses, and provided the means to endure. Without them, a man froze, starved, or wandered endlessly, unable to claim space against the elements. With them, he became more than a wanderer. He became a builder, a shaper of the land, a mountain man with roots instead of just tracks. Every cabin you've ever seen, every log wall still standing after centuries, began with the same ritual. A sharp axe, a steady saw, and the man who knew that losing them meant losing everything. Before a mountain man ever stacked a wall or chinked a crack with mud, there was one terrifying, exhausting, unavoidable task: bringing down the giants. Trees didn't politely fall into cabin-sized lengths just because you stared at them hard enough. They stood there, stubborn, massive, defiant. Some had been alive for centuries, stretching straight into the sky with trunks so wide you couldn't wrap your arms around them. To turn one of these into the skeleton of a cabin, you had to bring it down the hard way, with axe and saw, stroke after stroke, until the forest thundered with the crash. And felling trees wasn't just work. It was a gamble. Every swing, every creak, every final snap was a reminder that the wilderness didn't like being reshaped, and that if you guessed wrong, your new log might flatten you before it ever became a wall. The first step was choosing which giant to tackle. Not every tree was worth the effort. A good cabin log needed straightness, length, and minimal branches. A crooked trunk, twisted like a corkscrew, was worthless. A hollow tree filled with rot would collapse into mush after the first heavy rain. Mountain men learned to read the forest like a book. They tapped trunks with the butt of the axe, listening for the hollow thud of decay or the ringing solidity of healthy wood. They scanned the crown of branches, looking for weight distribution that hinted at which way the tree might fall. Every detail mattered, because once you started chopping, there was no going back. With the right tree chosen, the battle began. Swing by swing, the axe bit into the bark, cutting past the outer layers into the pale heartwood beneath. Chips flew, sap sprayed, sweat rolled down faces. The rhythm was hypnotic. Thunk, crack, thunk, crack, the forest echoing each strike. It wasn't glamorous work. Hours could pass with barely a notch cut deep enough to matter. Hands blistered, shoulders burned, and the air filled with the smell of fresh wood. Some men preferred to switch between axe and saw, using cross-cut blades to slice deeper into the trunk, especially when fatigue made swinging an axe less efficient. But either way, progress was slow, measured in inches. The danger wasn't just the work itself, but the moment of no return. As the tree weakened, it began to lean, groaning and creaking like some massive beast waking from a slumber. Mountain men had to read these sounds carefully. One wrong cut, one gust of wind, and the tree could pivot, twisting to fall in an unexpected direction. Countless men were crushed beneath their own timber, their cabins ending before the first wall was raised. That's why shouts of timber weren't jokes. They were life-saving warnings, signals to anyone nearby to scatter before tons of wood slammed into the ground. Even when everything went right, the final crash was violent. The trunk tore branches from neighbors, birds exploded from the canopy in panicked flocks, and the ground shook when the giant hit. The noise was deafening, the kind that echoed through valleys like a cannon. For a brief moment, the mountain man stood still, breathing hard, muscles quivering, staring at what he had done. One tree down, many more to go. A single cabin could eat up dozens of trees, sometimes more if mistakes were made or logs split poorly. Each crash was a victory, but also a reminder of how much work still lay ahead. Dragging and trimming came next. Once the giant lay on the ground, its branches had to be cut away, the trunk cleaned and prepped for dragging to the build site. This was another danger zone. Limbs snapped under tension, swinging violently. Axes bounced if struck wrong, glancing toward shins or feet. One slip and you weren't building a cabin anymore. You were fighting off blood loss with a rag and a prayer. Mountain men were careful, but also hardened to risk. Every scar on their hands and shins told a story of a log that fought back. Green wood added another challenge. Freshly felled trees were heavy, saturated with water and sap. Each log weighed hundreds of pounds, sometimes more. Rolling them took leverage, ropes, and sheer willpower. In snow, sledges and drags made hauling easier. On bare ground, logs had to be levered with poles, pried inch by inch until they inched toward camp. Some mountain men worked in teams, shouting and grunting as they muscled trunks into place. Lone men had to be even more inventive, using branches as skids or cutting paths downhill to let gravity help. But every log dragged into camp was a small miracle, proof that sheer stubbornness could move mountains, or at least trees. Felling wasn't only about strength, it was also about strategy. Trees cut too close together toppled into each other, tangling in branches, refusing to fall cleanly. Trees cut on slopes sometimes rolled downhill uncontrollably, smashing into other timber or even destroying a cabin site before construction began. Smart mountain men planned their cuts, clearing space and felling trees in patterns that minimized chaos. It wasn't modern forestry. but it was frontier engineering, born of necessity. And there was a psychological side. Felling the giants was exhausting, terrifying, and endless. Some men grew attached to the process, marveling at how a forest could be transformed log by log into a cabin. Others hated it, cursing every swing, every aching muscle, and every stubborn knot in the wood. But love it or hate it, they all respected it, because the trees held the power of survival, and the act of bringing one down wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. It meant claiming control over the wilderness, forcing it to serve as home instead of enemy. The risks of tree felling were remembered in stories. Men told of cabins left half-built because the builder was crushed by the very trees he sought to tame. They told of storms that toppled half-cut trunks onto men who didn't hear them coming. They told of accidents where saws slipped, axes shattered, or branches whipped back like spears. And yet, they kept swinging, because the alternative was worse. No shelter, no firewood, no chance of lasting the winter. Every log stacked into a cabin began its life with this brutal process. When you look at an old frontier cabin, its rough-hewn logs fitted together with moss and mud, you're really looking at weeks of battles with trees, each one felled by sweat, blood, and luck. Cabins weren't just built, they were wrestled from the forest one giant at a time. The axe and saw may have been the weapons, but the real war was against the size, weight, and stubbornness of nature itself. In the end, felling the giants was more than just construction. It was a ritual of frontier survival, a dangerous dance with gravity and wood. Every successful fall was a cheer against death, every crash a victory that echoed through the wilderness. Mountain men didn't just cut trees, they fought them, respected them, and depended on them. And when the walls of a cabin finally stood tall, those walls weren't just timber, they were trophies, proof of every battle won against the giants that once towered above. After the giants were finally brought down, the real grind began. A tree lying on the ground didn't magically transform into a cabin wall just because it stopped standing tall. To become part of a mountain man's fortress against the wilderness, each log had to go through its awkward teenage phase, being stripped, cleaned, and shaped into something usable. This was the stage nobody sang songs about, because let's be honest, debarking and shaping were some of the most monotonous, sweat-dripping, blister-inducing parts of cabin building. But skip them, and you weren't just cutting corners. You were building a bug hotel, a mold factory, and a warped wall all rolled into one. The logs had to be tamed before they could be stacked. The first order of business was getting rid of the bark. Sounds simple, right? Peel it off like an orange and move on. But trees don't shed their skins that easily. Bark clings, rough and stubborn, loaded with hidden pockets of insects, moisture, and rot. If you left it on, your beautiful new cabin would become a buffet for beetles, termites, and fungi within a season. Bark trapped dampness, encouraging decay that chewed through logs faster than winter chewed through your food supply. So debarking wasn't cosmetic, it was essential, the step that made sure your hard-won trees didn't betray you by rotting from the outside in. Mountain men used whatever tools they had on hand to get the job done. The most common was a draw knife, a simple but effective blade with handles on each side pulled toward the body to strip bark in long, curling sheets. When the wood was green and the sap still fresh, bark sometimes slid away with satisfying ease like peeling strips of hide. In colder weather or with older trees, it clung stubbornly, forcing hours of scraping, hacking, and prying. Some men used the edge of their axe, striking at shallow angles to strip away bark, though this dulled the blade quickly and made sharpening an endless chore. Others used improvised tools, sharp rocks, split antlers, or anything with an edge, because when you're out in the wilderness, You don't wait for perfect equipment. You make do. The work was punishing. Hands blistered, arms cramped, backs ached from bending over log after log. Sweat mixed with sap until you smelled like the forest itself, sticky and raw. Mosquitoes swarmed around, gnats stuck to your skin, and every scrape raised the question, why not just skip this? But every mountain man knew the answer. Skip debarking, and your cabin walls turned spongy with rot within a year. Insects burrowed in, leaving trails of sawdust as they hollowed out the very structure meant to keep you alive. Fireplaces smoked less when built against clean logs, and chinking held better when pressed against stripped surfaces. Debarking was misery now, but it bought survival later. Once the logs were bare, shaping began. Here's where raw timber turned into something resembling building blocks. Trees didn't grow like perfect cylinders, evenly sized and neatly tapered. They grew how they pleased, curving, swelling, narrowing. To make them stackable, mountain men trimmed, flattened, and notched. Some logs were hewn into half flats with a broad axe, squared enough to sit snugly on top of one another. Others were left round, but ends were carved carefully to fit corners. Every log needed attention, because one uneven piece could throw the whole wall crooked, leaving gaps big enough to let in freezing drafts, or worse, letting the wall buckle under weight. Notching was the mountain man's real test. This was where skill separated survivors from amateurs. The classic saddle notch was most common, carved into the ends of logs, so they cradled each other tightly at corners, locking in place without nails. The trick was precision. Too shallow, and the logs slid around like loose teeth. Too deep, and you weakened the whole structure. Each notch was hacked with an axe, sometimes refined with a knife, always checked and rechecked against its mate. When the fit was right, it felt like magic. Two massive logs joining seamlessly, strength multiplied rather than lost. Building a cabin wasn't just stacking wood. It was carpentry with consequences, and notching was where the difference between cozy shelter and pile of firewood was decided. Shaping also meant deciding which log went where. The thickest, heaviest logs anchored the bottom, bearing the weight of the walls. Straighter, lighter ones went higher up, easier to hoist into place. Crooked or flawed logs were saved for roof beams, joists, or firewood. Mountain men thought like chess players, planning moves ahead, knowing which logs would support others, which would need trimming, and which would bend into place without complaint. A cabin wasn't random. It was deliberate, every log chosen and shaped with care. Even bark scraps and chips didn't go to waste. Stripped bark sometimes lined floors, making mud less suffocating. Chips fed fires or cushioned bedding under hides. Nothing in the wilderness was truly garbage. Everything had a second life, if you had the creativity to use it. Mountain men weren't just builders, they were recyclers before the term even existed. Debarking and shaping could stretch on for days, sometimes weeks, depending on how large a cabin was planned and how many men worked together. Lone trappers often cursed the workload, stripping until their hands cramped, shaping until sweat blurred their vision. Groups fared better, sharing the grind, joking or singing to keep spirits up. Still, even with teamwork, the job was brutal. There was no shortcut. Every log had to be stripped, every notch carved, every mistake corrected. The wilderness didn't reward impatience. And then there was Greenwood's nasty secret. Freshly cut logs shrank as they dried, warping and twisting. Even carefully shaped, tightly notched logs would shift over months, pulling apart or squeezing tighter. Mountain men planned for this, carving notches slightly oversized, knowing the cabin would settle. Sometimes doors jammed, windows shifted, or roofs sagged as logs moved. That was normal. A cabin wasn't finished the day it was built. It was a living structure, shifting and settling like a beast breathing in its sleep. Shaping wasn't just about today's fit. It was about predicting tomorrow's changes and compensating before they happened. By the time the logs were ready, a mountain man could look at his pile and see more than wood. He saw hours of sweat, the sting of blisters, the rhythm of scraping bark, the careful angle of axe strokes. Each log was a piece of himself, labor turned into survival. And though the process was dull and punishing, it was also deeply satisfying. When you ran your hand along a smooth, clean log, free of bark, shaped into form, you weren't just touching wood, you were touching progress. This stage was quiet compared to the thunder of falling trees, but no less important. Felling the giants was dramatic. Debarking and shaping were patient, stubborn acts of will. They were the unsung backbone of cabin building, the steps that no one bragged about but everyone relied on. Because without stripped shaped logs, your cabin was just a heap of rotting sticks. With them, you had the bones of a fortress, ready to rise one wall at a time. In the end, debarking and shaping proved what frontier life was all about: patience, persistence, and respect for the details. Mountain men didn't have blueprints or architects. They had sweat, axes, and the knowledge that cutting corners meant paying the price later. Every smooth log and every perfect notch was a promise that this cabin would stand against the wind, the snow, the wolves, and the endless wilderness pressing in on every side. And that promise began with the simple, grueling, unforgettable act of peeling bark and shaping wood. Once the logs were stripped and shaped, and the sweat had dried into stiff salt lines on a mountain man's shirt, the temptation was to start stacking right away. After all, the vision of a cabin was close, 4 walls rising, smoke curling from a chimney, and a roof holding back the snow. But charging into construction without laying a foundation was like pouring soup into a basket, messy, pointless, and bound to fail. Even in the wilderness, without blueprints, concrete, or nails, mountain men knew you had to start from the ground up. A cabin's foundation was the hidden secret of survival, the difference between a sturdy winter fortress and a sagging pile of logs collapsing into mud. At first glance, you might think, it's just logs stacked on dirt. What's the big deal? But dirt has opinions. Rain turns it to mud, snowmelt soaks it through, and roots creep upward like thieves. Build straight on bare ground, and the lowest logs rot fast, sucking up moisture until they crumble. A cabin without a foundation might look fine for a season, but by the next spring, it would smell like mildew, sag like an old mule's back, and invite every creeping insect to move in rent-free. Mountain men had learned this the hard way. A rotting base meant wasted effort, and wasted effort in the wilderness meant death waiting patiently at the door. So the first task of foundation building was choosing how to lift the cabin off the earth. Rocks were the simplest solution. If you were lucky enough to be near a riverbed or a slope littered with boulders, you hauled stones until your back ached and your hands bled. Heavy, flat ones worked best, stacked in crude piers under the corners and along the cabin's footprint. These stone supports raised the lowest logs above the wet ground, letting air flow underneath and slowing rot. It wasn't perfect. Damp still crept in, frost still heaved the stones during brutal winters, but it bought time. And time was everything. Not every mountain man had rocks to spare. In thick forests, stone was scarce, and hauling it from far off was a luxury of energy few could afford. In those cases, log sills were the go-to. Massive, thick logs, often of rot-resistant wood like cedar or oak, were laid directly on the ground, squared and leveled as best as possible. These sacrificial logs took the brunt of dampness, serving as the bones that carried the weight of the cabin. They would eventually rot, but slowly, giving the structure years of stability before repairs became necessary. Choosing the right sill logs was an act of foresight. Smart mountain men picked the toughest wood available. sometimes even burning or charring the bottom slightly to harden them against moisture. It wasn't elegant, but it was frontier engineering at its most practical. Digging foundations was another tactic, though more laborious. Some cabins had shallow trenches dug where sill logs would rest, filled with gravel or sand to improve drainage. Others sat partly dug into slopes, with one side carved into earth for protection against wind. But digging meant exposure to floods and cave-ins, if not done carefully. A poorly dug foundation became a water trap, and water was the eternal enemy of wood. Mountain men didn't always have the luxury of perfection, but the ones who thought carefully about drainage outlived those who slapped logs straight on wet soil. Leveling the foundation was its own ordeal. Uneven bases meant tilted walls, crooked roofs, and chimneys that smoked you out of your own home. Without spirit levels or modern tools, mountain men relied on string, sight, and instinct. They crouched low, squinted across logs, adjusted stones, and hacked at high spots until the base sat flat. Even then, cabins often leaned slightly, giving them the charming but deadly, crooked look we romanticize today. A tilted cabin might look rustic on a postcard, but in reality, it meant endless drafts, stuck doors, and collapsing beams. Survival demanded straightness, even if your eye was the only level you had. Once the foundation was set, the first course of logs, the base layer, was placed carefully, sometimes with ceremony. These were the anchor logs, the ones that bore the entire weight of walls, roof, and snow. A cracked or flawed log here was a death sentence later. Men often took extra time to fit these pieces, trimming, shifting, and adjusting until they lay tight against one another. In some traditions, the laying of the first log was celebrated with a meal or a toast, a small moment of pride in the endless grind of survival. After all, until that first layer was down, a cabin was just an idea. With it, it became reality. Even the ground beneath the cabin wasn't ignored. Dirt floors were standard at first, packed earth flattened by boots and tamped hard until it resembled clay. But dirt had its problems. Rainwater seeped in, turning the floor to muck. Insects burrowed upward. Smells lingered, heavy with smoke, sweat, and food scraps. To fix this, mountain men sometimes laid bark or straw over the earth, creating a barrier. Others dug shallow pits for drainage, or raised wooden planks when tools and time allowed. A true plank floor was a luxury, usually reserved for seasoned cabins or those built near trading posts where saws and nails were easier to come by. But even crude improvements meant a world of difference to comfort and health. What often gets overlooked is how foundations weren't just about the cabin, they were about the people living inside. A poorly drained base meant sickness, dampness, and constant battle against mold. Cold crept up through the floor, gnawing at bones, making every night a test of endurance. A solid foundation, by contrast, made the cabin feel secure, dry, and warm. It wasn't just wood on stone, it was the difference between sleeping soundly and coughing your lungs out all winter. Building a foundation also had a psychological weight. Mountain men spent so much time on it because they knew, get the base wrong and everything above it was wasted. It was patience training, frontier style. You wanted walls rising fast, a roof over your head, smoke rising from a chimney, but you forced yourself to squat in mud, roll stones, drag massive sills, and check levels again and again. Because rushing the foundation wasn't brave, it was stupid, and stupidity got punished quickly in the wilderness. There were stories of men who ignored foundations, slapping cabins straight on dirt. For a season, they boasted about their speed. By the next year, their cabins sagged like drunkards, walls twisted, logs blackened with mold. Some abandoned them, retreating to tents or lean-tos. Others rebuilt from scratch, muttering curses and vowing never to skip steps again. The survivors learned cabins didn't forgive shortcuts, and neither did the wilderness. Foundations, in the end, weren't glamorous. Nobody sang ballads about dragging stones through mud or laying sill logs straight. But every surviving cabin that still stands today, weathered and scarred, owes its endurance to those hidden supports. They're the part nobody sees, but everybody relies on. The base logs, the stone piers, the drainage trenches, all silent, all vital, all holding back time, weather, and decay. So when a mountain man stepped back to look at his foundation, sweat running into his beard, mud clinging to his boots, he wasn't just seeing logs on rocks, he was seeing the promise of survival. 4 walls would rise, a roof would shelter, a fire would warm, but only because the foundation held firm. In that moment, even the roughest, loneliest trapper felt something like pride, because against the wild, against the endless press of snow and wind and predators, he had laid down a base, not just for a cabin, but for a life carved out of the unforgiving mountains. Once the foundation was solid and the first heavy sills were in place, the moment came that made all the back-breaking prep suddenly feel worth it, raising the walls. This was the iconic stage of log cabin building, the part every kid pictures when they hear frontier life, the Lincoln logs of reality. But unlike toys that fit neatly and weigh nothing, these were 100-pound beasts that had to be lifted, wrestled, and notched into place with nothing but grit, calloused hands, and maybe the occasional swear loud enough to scare a bear off the ridge. Stacking the walls wasn't just construction, it was an act of defiance against the wilderness, proof that raw trees could be tamed into a fortress of survival. The first logs, called sill logs, lay flat across the foundation stones or base timbers. Once they were squared and leveled, the whole structure depended on them. Then came the task of laying the next layer, and the next, each log crisscrossing at the corners, notched to lock tightly together. Notching was the secret sauce. Without it, logs would roll like stubborn barrels, walls would lean outward, and the whole thing might collapse in the first strong wind. Mountain men carved their notches with precision, axe and knife, working patiently to cut half-moons or saddle grooves that cradled the logs above. Too shallow, and the fit was loose. Too deep, and the log weakened, threatening to crack under pressure. Getting it right was a skill learned by experience, often through painful trial and error. Each notch told a story of patience. Mountain men squatted over logs, hacking carefully, then testing, lifting, and dropping the next log into place to see if it fit snug. Sometimes it did, and the sound of the log thudding down tight was as satisfying as music. Other times it wobbled, shifted, or gapped, and the man cursed, lifted it back off, shaved more wood, and tried again. The process was repetitive, frustrating, but also strangely rewarding. When the corners began to rise and 4 crude walls started taking shape, the cabin stopped being an idea and started being a home. Lifting the logs into place was its own kind of misery. These weren't delicate beams from a lumberyard. They were raw trunks, heavy and awkward. A single man could sometimes lever logs up with poles, sliding them into place inch by inch. Groups of trappers, neighbors or family made it faster, hefting together with grunts and shouts, the logs swaying dangerously before settling with a boom. Many hands made lighter work, but many hands weren't always available. Lone builders had to rely on ingenuity, rolling logs up ramps, levering them with stakes, or rigging crude pulleys with rope. Each successful lift was a minor miracle, each wall higher than the last, a victory earned in sweat. The gaps between logs were inevitable. No matter how carefully you chose and shaped them, trees weren't perfect cylinders. Spaces opened, sometimes small slivers, sometimes gaps big enough to stick a hand through. Leaving them open meant drafts slicing through, snow piling inside, and pests crawling in. That's where chinking and daubing came in, a mix of mud, moss, clay, grass, even animal hair jammed into the cracks like primitive caulk. At first, chinking was temporary, packed in quickly just to keep the night air from freezing your bones. Later, men improved it, layering clay and straw, smoothing it with care until the walls looked solid. Chinking wasn't glamorous, but without it, your carefully stacked walls were just a giant sieve. The rhythm of wall stacking was grueling but addictive. Log after log, row after row, the structure grew. Each day ended with a cabin a little taller, the shadows inside a little deeper. By night, you could stretch out under the rising walls and feel, for the first time, the security of boundaries. Wolves might howl, storms might rage, but the walls stood between you and the wild. Even incomplete, they gave a sense of progress, of protection. It wasn't finished, but it was something. And in the wilderness, something was priceless. The corners were the pride of every builder. Smooth, tight-fitting notches meant strength, walls that stood straight through winter storms. Sloppy corners were shameful, mocked by neighbors, whispered about by travelers. A man's reputation could be measured in his cabin's corners. Did the logs lock tight? Did the walls rise square? Or did the whole place lean like it had too much whiskey? Mountain men cared, because their cabins weren't just homes. They were proof of skill, toughness, and determination. A solidly stacked wall was as much a badge of honor as a fine rifle or a full trap line. And yet, no cabin was ever perfect. Logs shifted as they dried, gaps opened and walls settled, doors jammed, windows warped, corners cracked. Mountain men expected it. They built with the knowledge that the first winter would test everything and that repairs were inevitable. Still, the act of stacking walls was the moment when survival became visible, when you could finally see the outline of a home against the sky. Stories from the frontier often mention the noise of stacking, the thud of logs, the ring of axes, the grunt of men straining to lift. In lonely valleys, that noise was a declaration. A man was here, carving out space from the wild. Travelers stumbling across half-finished cabins often paused in awe. Even rough, even crooked, the walls stood as proof of human stubbornness, of the refusal to bow to endless forest and empty sky. Stacking walls was dangerous too. Logs slipped, crushing hands or feet. A poorly balanced log could roll, slamming into legs or chests. Builders had to stay sharp, keep footing steady, and respect the weight of their materials. More than one cabin was stained with blood before it was finished, but the risk was accepted because the reward was survival. Better a bruised leg or a smashed thumb than a winter without walls. As the walls grew higher, the sense of accomplishment grew too. Standing inside a half-built cabin, looking up at the log edges silhouetted against the sky, a mountain man felt a rare mix of exhaustion and pride. Here was shelter rising from nothing. Here was defiance against cold, predators, hunger, and loneliness. The walls meant warmth, security, and a kind of permanence. For men who wandered trap lines for months, the cabin wasn't just wood stacked high, it was the closest thing to civilization. By the time the last wall was chest high, the shape of the cabin was undeniable. The wilderness had been pushed back, log by log, into submission, and though the roof, chimney, and finishing touches were still far away, the walls marked the true beginning of home. Every mountain man who raised them knew it. Without walls, you had nothing. With them, you had a fighting chance. So stacking the walls wasn't just construction, it was triumph. It was the turning point where raw trees became survival, where sweat and danger turned into shelter. And when the last log of a wall thudded into place, the echo wasn't just noise. It was a promise that winter could rage, wolves could howl, storms could break, and yet inside those walls there would be life, warmth, and the stubborn endurance of a man who refused to yield. Stacking the walls was a triumph, but any mountain man who stood inside his freshly raised log cabin quickly realized the truth. Walls alone weren't enough. Between each massive log, no matter how carefully shaped or tightly notched, there were gaps, some as small as a finger's width, others wide enough for a mouse to stroll through with swagger. Those cracks were invisible during the day when the sun warmed your back, but at night, when icy winds whistled through, they became torture devices. A cabin without sealed gaps was nothing more than a giant flute, the wilderness playing cruel songs of frost and misery through every space in the wood. Filling those gaps, chinking and daubing, wasn't glamorous, but it was the difference between a cabin that kept you alive and a cabin that slowly froze you to death. Mountain men didn't have fiberglass insulation, caulking guns, or tidy tubes of weatherproofing. What they had was the land around them and their creativity. Chinking was the name for stuffing the larger gaps, the base material crammed in tight to block space. Daubing was the plaster-like smear that went over the chinking, sealing it against wind and water. Together, they turned drafty walls into something approaching solid insulation. The materials varied depending on where you built. Moss ripped from rocks, dry grasses, handfuls of leaves, animal hair, and even scraps of old clothing were pressed into cracks. Mud, clay, and wet earth were then smeared over, sometimes mixed with straw, to add strength until the walls were sealed. It was primitive, messy, and always imperfect, but it worked. The process started with gathering. Mountain men scoured the area around their cabins for anything fibrous and stuffable. Moss was a favorite, springy and easy to jam into cracks. Clay-rich soil was gold, sticky and pliable, perfect for smearing and drying hard. Grass was plentiful, but alone it was too flimsy. It needed mud to hold it in place. Some men even sacrificed hair from animal pelts or hides, ripping fibers to add to their chinking mix. Every cabin was only as strong as the land it sat on, and every wall gap demanded tribute from the surrounding wilderness. Stuffing the gaps wasn't dignified work. Mountain men crouched, knelt, and stretched, pressing handfuls of moss or straw into every line between logs. Fingers grew raw, nails clogged with dirt, hands cracked from cold mud. The work took hours, sometimes days, because every single gap had to be filled, no matter how small. Leave one open, and the wind would find it, howling through like it had been invited. And the wind in the mountains wasn't kind. It cut through clothing, froze fingers, and stole body heat faster than a wolf stole unattended meat. Chinking wasn't optional, it was survival's demand. Once the base was in, daubing began. Clay or mud was smeared over the stuffed cracks, pressed with hands, sticks, or improvised paddles. It hardened in the sun, forming a crust that bound everything together. The first layer often cracked as it dried, forcing mountain men to patch again and again, layering more mud until the wall looked rough but tight. Smoke from the fireplace stained the inner daubing. Rain streaked the outer. But if done well, the cabin held heat like a pot on coals. Done poorly, it leaked, and the man inside cursed his shortcuts every freezing night. Winter tested every cabin's chinking. As the temperature dropped, materials shrank, cracked, or loosened. Clay pulled away, moss dried out, grass crumbled. Gaps reappeared like ghosts, letting cold air in. Mountain men spent countless evenings restuffing and patching, crawling around their own cabins with hands full of mud, swearing at drafts. In deep snow, they sometimes banked drifts against the outside walls for extra insulation, turning the cabin into a half-buried den. Inside, they hung animal hides on the walls, doubling down on blocking the cold. Chinking wasn't a one-time job. It was constant maintenance, an endless war against air, moisture, and decay. Chinking materials also told stories about where a man lived. Cabins in pine forests used moss pulled from tree trunks. Cabins in clay-rich valleys boasted smoother, stronger daubing. Cabins near marshes smelled of reeds and grasses. Each frontier home was a fingerprint of its environment, stitched together from whatever the land offered. Some cabins even had a mix so wild it became legend. Stories tell of men stuffing cracks with shredded shirts, dried dung, even fur scraps left from skinning animals. It didn't matter if it was pretty. It only mattered if it blocked the wind. The look of a freshly chinked cabin wasn't romantic. It was lumpy, uneven, streaked with mud and straw sticking out like hair. But for mountain men, beauty wasn't the goal. Warmth was. A rough, mud-smeared cabin was a palace compared to the bitter cold of a tent. Inside, the difference was instant. The fire's warmth stayed longer, drafts lessened, and the space began to feel like something you could actually live in rather than merely endure. A properly sealed cabin turned the howling storm outside into background noise, while inside, the mountain man stretched out by the fire, at least somewhat confident he wouldn't freeze in his sleep. Chinking wasn't foolproof. Rain washed out the mud. Heat from the fireplace baked cracks open. Insects burrowed into moss. Birds stole grass for their nests, and mice gnawed away at whatever fibers they could reach. Some cabins had to be re-chinked every season, patched and repatched, until the walls looked like patchwork quilts of mud and straw. But that was the reality of survival. Nothing lasted forever. Maintenance was as much a part of life as hunting or chopping wood. There was also an art to knowing how much to stuff and how much to smear. Too much chinking pressed in too tight, splitting logs apart as they shifted with drying. Too little, and drafts poured through anyway. A skilled builder learned by touch, the way the moss compressed, the way the clay spread smooth. In some cabins, women and children helped with chinking, their smaller hands perfect for pressing into narrow cracks. Even in lone mountain man cabins, the act of sealing walls had a rhythm, a strange satisfaction in closing the wilderness out one gap at a time. Inside the cabin, the results were obvious. Without chinking, smoke curled sideways in every draft, fires struggled to heat the room, and sleep was a miserable shiver. With chinking, the fire roared stronger, heat stayed trapped, and the walls began to feel solid. The cabin transformed from a leaky box into a genuine shelter. It wasn't luxurious. Mud streaked the edges, flakes crumbled into corners, bugs sometimes wriggled free. But it was livable, and livable was the only luxury that mattered. Some cabins stood for decades, their chinking replaced and renewed with each season. Their walls thickened with the fingerprints of generations. Others were abandoned after a few winters, their daubing washed away, their cracks widening until the wind howled freely once more. Travelers stumbling across such ruins could tell at once whether the builder cared about sealing his home. A cabin with walls still tightly packed, even after years, spoke of pride and persistence. One with gaps yawning wide told of shortcuts, laziness, or defeat. In the mythology of the frontier, people remember the axes and the rifles, the danger and the daring. Few remember the mountain man on his knees, hands caked in mud, stuffing moss into cracks by firelight. But that's the truth of survival. The glamorous parts, the roaring fire, the sturdy roof, the walls rising tall, only worked because of the unglamorous. Without chinking and daubing, the wilderness always found its way inside. With it, the mountain man carved a bubble of warmth and life against the endless cold. So filling the gaps wasn't just maintenance. It was the invisible hero of cabin building, the unsung act that kept frostbite at bay, kept smoke curling upward, kept men alive through howling nights. And when a mountain man lay in bed, wrapped in hides, listening to the storm claw at his cabin, he had Chinking to thank for the fact that the storm stayed outside. The walls weren't perfect, the daubing cracked, but they held, and in the wilderness, that was everything. By the time the walls stood tall and the chinking had been stuffed and smeared into every drafty gap, a mountain man might feel a flicker of pride. 4 sturdy walls rose from the ground, proof that he had carved order from wilderness. But then came the most dangerous, most frustrating, and most absolutely necessary part of all, the roof. Without it, his beautiful new cabin was nothing more than a glorified pen for wind and rain. The roof was the line between survival and misery, the shield that had to hold against snowdrifts, downpours, and storms that howled like wolves across the ridges. Raising the roof wasn't just construction. It was a battle with gravity itself, a test of muscle, balance, and ingenuity. Cabin roofs started with beams, massive heavy logs stretched across the walls like ribs. These were the bones of the shelter, the framework that would carry everything piled on top. Lifting them was no joke. Even small beams weighed hundreds of pounds, and with walls chest-high or taller, getting them into place was a wrestling match between man and tree. Lone mountain men had to rig ramps, levers, and pulleys from whatever rope and timber they had, inching beams upward with the kind of patience that made saints look lazy. Those lucky enough to have friends or family pitched in, heaving and grunting together, lifting each beam until it slid into notches carved on the wall tops. Every beam raised was a small miracle, every slip a chance to break bones or smash walls before the cabin was even finished. The angle of the roof mattered as much as the beams themselves. Too flat, and rain pooled, seeping through, soaking bedding, rotting logs. Too steep, and snow slid too fast, crashing down in avalanches that buried doorways and crushed firewood stacks. Mountain men learned by trial and error. In snow-heavy regions, roofs sloped sharply so drifts would slide off before crushing the structure. In milder places, flatter roofs worked, easier to build and requiring less timber. But no matter the angle, the roof had to be strong enough to hold the weight of snow, rain, and whatever animals decided to scamper across in the night. Once the beams were set, smaller poles or split logs were laid crosswise, forming a lattice. These secondary supports held the covering, whatever material the land provided. Bark was common, peeled in great sheets from trees and layered like shingles. Birch bark especially was prized, flexible and somewhat waterproof. In forested regions, men split shakes or shingles from straight-grained logs, pounding them out with axes and mallets until they could be overlapped tightly across the roof frame. Shakes took time and patience, but they lasted longer and looked almost civilized compared to bark. In treeless highlands or prairies, sod roofs were the fallback, thick squares of earth and grass cut from the ground and laid in heavy layers across poles. They insulated well, but weighed a ton, literally pressing down on the beams beneath. If your walls and base weren't strong, a sod roof could crush your cabin before the first snowfall even arrived. Whatever the material, the layering was crucial. Roofs had to shed water like a duck's back. Overlaps were tight, angled to push rain downward and outward instead of letting it seep inside. Moss or mud sometimes filled gaps, daubed along seams to slow leaks. But the truth was harsh. Most roofs leaked, at least a little. Mountain men often woke to cold drips on their faces during storms, grumbling as they shifted bedding away from trickles. A perfect roof was rare. A good enough roof, though, that was survival. The act of building the roof tested every ounce of strength and balance. Mountain men perched on log edges, teetering high above uneven ground, sweat dripping into their eyes, arms straining as they hauled materials up. Falls were common. A slip meant broken bones, and broken bones in the wilderness often meant death. Every nail-less joint, every mud-smeared seam, every carefully laid pole carried the weight of risk. Raising the roof wasn't just about weatherproofing, it was about daring gravity to take you down and winning anyway. Inside the cabin, the difference a roof made was instant. Before, it was a box open to the sky, a place where stars and snow had equal access. After, it was a true shelter, dim, smoky, but enclosed. The roof trapped heat, kept rain off bedding, and muffled the roar of the storm. Fires burned steadier without rain spitting into them. Sleep came easier without snowflakes landing on your face. And psychologically, the roof was everything. It was the finishing touch that turned walls into a home, that finally made the cabin feel real. A man could sit by his fire, hear the storm hammering above, and know, this time, the storm was losing. Of course, roofs demanded constant repair. Bark curled and shrank, shingles split, sod sagged, wind ripped pieces free, animals burrowed through, and water always found a way to sneak inside. Mountain men patched endlessly, climbing up in all seasons to replace layers, smear fresh mud, or reset sod. The roof wasn't a one-and-done project. It was a living part of the cabin, always in need of care. But that care was worth it. A good roof turned survival from a daily gamble into a daily grind, and the grind was always better than the gamble. Stories spread of cabins crushed under snow when beams were too weak, of roofs ripped clean off by storms when angles were wrong, of sod piles caving in like landslides. These stories were cautionary tales, lessons passed between trappers and pioneers. Don't skimp on beams, don't cut corners on overlap, don't trust a roof you built in a hurry. Mountain men respected their roofs the way sailors respected their ships, because one failure could mean the end. And yet, for all the frustration, the moment the roof was finished was one of the great victories of frontier life. A man could stand back, wipe sweat from his brow, and look at a structure that actually resembled a home. Logs stacked into walls, gaps stuffed with moss and mud, beams braced, coverings laid tight. It all came together in the peak of a roof rising against the sky. That peak was more than wood. It was hope, stubborn and solid, declaring that even in the wildest wilderness, humans could carve out shelter with their bare hands. Raising the roof wasn't the end of work. Chimneys, floors, doors, and endless chores still waited. But it was the defining moment when a cabin went from temporary to permanent. It was the crown that proved a mountain man's labor had beaten back the wind and rain. And when storms rattled across the ridges, when snow piled heavy, when wolves howled outside, the mountain man could lean back against his wall, listen to the roof hold firm, and smile through the smoke, because he had raised it with sweat, danger, and determination. And for that, he had a home. Once the roof was up and the cabin finally felt like a real box against the wilderness, mountain men faced the next survival test: heat. Because walls and roofs alone didn't keep you alive in the Rockies or Appalachians. Without fire, you froze. Without fire, you couldn't cook the meat you trapped or dry the hides you skinned. But having fire meant nothing if you couldn't control it. A smoky blaze in the middle of the floor was just a fast ticket to suffocation. You needed a fireplace, you needed a chimney, and in the world of log cabins, building that chimney was one of the hardest, most dangerous, and most crucial steps of all. The earliest cabins started simple: dig a pit in the floor, stack a rough hearth from stones, let smoke drift through a hole in the roof. It worked, sort of. If by worked, you mean the builder spent every night coughing up soot and blinking through stingy eyes while his clothes and hair reeked like a smoked ham. It didn't take long to realize a chimney was the real key. A proper fireplace and chimney funneled smoke upward, kept sparks contained and radiated heat into the room. Without one, the cabin was a choking box of misery. With one, it became survivable, even almost cozy on bitter nights. But mountain men didn't have bricks or mortar waiting neatly in piles. They had to improvise with whatever the land offered. Stone was the gold standard. If you were lucky enough to live near a creek bed or rocky hillside, you hauled stone after stone, piling them into a chimney that rose against one wall of the cabin. Big flat stones made the base, smaller ones filled gaps, and mud or clay served as mortar. Each stone had to be wrestled into place by hand, heavy enough to crush toes if dropped, awkward enough to slip when wet. Lifting them into a sturdy tower took patience and a sense of balance that came from trial and error. A chimney had to be stable because one collapse didn't just waste time, it could set the whole cabin on fire. Clay chimneys were the next option. Where stone was scarce, mountain men built wooden frames, then plastered them with clay and mud. The idea was simple. Logs or poles formed the skeleton, while layers of sticky clay coated the inside to protect from flame. It sounded clever, and when done right, it worked well enough to vent smoke. But clay cracked when it dried, and wood frames sometimes caught fire if the coating wasn't thick enough. More than one mountain man lost his cabin because his clay chimney flared up like a torch during the night. Still, when options were limited, clay and wood chimneys were better than nothing. They just demanded constant patching, more mud smeared over cracks whenever smoke leaked into the room. Some men experimented with cat and clay chimneys, a mix of sticks woven together, plastered thick with clay and straw, hardened by fire smoke. These looked crude, but could last a few years if maintained. They smoked less than open pits, provided a place to hang kettles, and radiated enough heat to dry hides strung along the rafters. But like all frontier fixes, they came with risk. Rain softened the clay, wind cracked it, and sparks found weaknesses. A mountain man never really trusted his chimney. He just hoped it lasted through the winter without betraying him. The fireplace itself was both heart and hazard. Built wide enough to hold logs that could burn all night, it became the gathering point. Meat roasted on spits, kettles of stew simmered, and firelight flickered against rough-hewn walls. But the fireplace was also greedy, demanding constant feeding. A badly designed hearth wasted heat, sending warmth up the chimney instead of into the room. Stones placed wrong tumbled free, spilling embers onto floors. Sparks shot out, threatening to ignite bedding or the very log walls themselves. Mountain men often smeared clay across the hearthstones and around the opening, sealing gaps and reducing the chance of disaster. Still, cabins burned often. A single chimney floor could undo months of back-breaking labor in one night of flames. Keeping the chimney drawing properly was its own science. If it was too short, smoke filled the room instead of escaping. Too tall, and it pulled heat away with the smoke, leaving the cabin freezing even as the fire roared. Drafts through the door or chinking could mess with airflow, sending smoke swirling unpredictably. Mountain men learned to adjust by instinct, shifting logs, adding dampers of wood or stone, experimenting until smoke rose cleanly and heat stayed inside. It was trial and error every day, a constant reminder that in the wilderness, nothing ever worked perfectly. The chimney became more than a tool. It became a symbol. When smoke finally curled upward into the cold sky, visible from a distance, it marked the cabin as alive. To passing trappers or travelers, that thin column of smoke was a beacon of human presence in a sea of wilderness. It meant warmth, maybe food, maybe company. For the man inside, watching smoke escape instead of choking his lungs, it meant safety. His home was real now, functional. The storm could rage, the wolves could howl, but he had fire under control. That was the true triumph of the chimney. Building it wasn't just skill, it was patience under danger. balancing stones, hauling clay, patching cracks, testing drafts. It all took endless labor, often while already exhausted from felling, stacking, and roofing. Fingers bled from sharp rocks, arms burned from lifting, backs ached from stooping in the mud. Yet no one skipped the chimney, because no matter how tired you were, you knew one truth. Without a fireplace, the cabin wasn't a home. It was a coffin waiting for winter. Travelers and historians later marveled at how crude chimneys could still last decades. Some stone hearths still stand in ruins, long after the cabins around them rotted away. Silent monuments to the skill and sweat of their builders. Each blackened stone, each clay-streaked wall tells the same story, that survival in the frontier depended not just on walls or roofs, but on controlling the one element humans needed most: fire. And so, the chimney challenge was never optional. It was the final great hurdle in making a cabin habitable, the step that turned a cold box of logs into a living, breathing shelter. Raising the roof kept the rain out, but the chimney kept life in. It let men cook, warm themselves, and even relax for a fleeting moment, staring at flames instead of the endless dark. Every time smoke curled into the sky, it was a victory cry, a message to the wilderness. We've bent you to our will, and we're still here. For all the sweat poured into walls, the danger of beams, the fiddly work of chinking, and the miracle of raising a roof that didn't collapse, the first time a mountain man walked into his cabin and looked down, he was greeted with the most humble, least impressive part of his new fortress: dirt. Not polished planks, not stone slabs, not anything that would impress visitors back in the cities. Just raw, packed earth. And that earth was exactly as rough as you'd imagine. Cold, damp, and stubbornly alive with bugs, smells, and mud. The dirt floor was the default of frontier cabins, the baseline reality of mountain men's survival homes. And while it sounds miserable, it was what most cabins had, at least in the beginning. Packing the dirt down was the first step. A bare patch of forest ground wasn't ready to become a living space without some work. Mountain men dug out roots, leveled rocks, and tamped the soil until it hardened into something resembling a floor. Sometimes they soaked it with water and pounded it flat with heavy beams or the backs of shovels, turning loose dirt into a clay-like surface. This made it firmer, less likely to crumble under boots. Still, rain seeped in, tracked mud stained everything, and smoke from the fire mixed with the smell of damp soil to create a constant earthy funk. No one would mistake it for comfortable, but compared to sleeping outside in snow, it was luxury enough. Of course, dirt floors brought problems. Cold radiated upward, chilling the cabin no matter how hard the fire burned. Moisture seeped through during storms or snowmelt, creating puddles in corners, sometimes turning the middle of the cabin into a swampy mess. Insects crawled freely, ants and beetles exploring the cracks, while rodents tunneled upward if they smelled food. Mountain men lived with the reality that their floor was not just ground, but part of the ecosystem around them. Their home was never fully separate from the wilderness. It was stitched into it, sometimes uncomfortably close. That's why upgrades began as soon as energy and resources allowed. Straw or rushes were a common fix, spread across the floor to create a barrier against damp and cold. It wasn't perfect, but it softened the ground, muffled the chill, and could be replaced when it rotted. Animal hides often covered sleeping areas, creating islands of relative comfort in the sea of dirt. Some mountain men gathered bark sheets or thin saplings, laying them side by side like crude planks. These makeshift coverings kept feet drier and spirits higher, especially in the heart of winter. For those with more time, real plank floors were the dream. Split logs flattened on one side became puncheon floors, laid flat across the dirt and fitted together as tightly as possible. Rough, uneven and creaky, they were still leagues better than bare soil. Puncheon floors made sweeping possible, kept pests down, and added an air of civilization to an otherwise primitive cabin. But they demanded extra timber, extra cutting, and extra time, luxuries a lone trapper didn't always have. Larger settlements or family-built cabins were more likely to have puncheon floors, while solitary mountain men often stuck with dirt until they simply couldn't bear it any longer. Dirt floors also told stories about the lives lived above them. Constant foot traffic packed paths harder where men walked daily. Cooking areas near the fireplace grew black with soot and grease. Sleeping corners flattened with hides developed hollows, worn down by years of restless bodies. Sometimes floors even became storage, pits dug into the dirt and hidden under straw, storing root vegetables or valuables. In some ways, the floor was less a surface and more a living record of the cabin's use, shaped by survival itself. But for all its drawbacks, the dirt floor had one hidden advantage. It was easy to maintain. No nails to split, no planks to rot, no boards to replace. If the floor became uneven, you tamped it down. If puddles formed, you dug shallow drainage channels. If the smell grew unbearable, you covered it with fresh straw. In a world where energy was precious, simplicity often won. Dirt never failed completely. It was always there, patient, waiting for you to keep living on it. Mountain men joked that their floors were half the reason for their toughness. Walking barefoot on frozen earth toughened skin. Sleeping above damp ground hardened resolve. Complaining about it changed nothing, so they learned to adapt. Visitors from cities might recoil at the sight of a mud-packed cabin floor, but for the men who lived there, it was just another part of frontier life, as normal as the sound of an axe or the smell of smoke. Still, whenever possible, upgrades came. Puncheon floors were treasured, and those who had them bragged quietly. Some cabins even featured raised wooden platforms along the sides, serving as beds or storage, keeping possessions above the damp. Families often prioritized flooring once walls and roofs were complete, knowing that comfort, however crude, boosted morale, and morale mattered. In a place where loneliness, cold, and hunger pressed hard every day, even the smallest improvement felt monumental. The dirt floor stage of a cabin's life was rarely permanent, but it was universal. Every cabin began with earth, just as every mountain man began his survival with nothing but tools and grit. From there, the evolution of the floor mirrored the evolution of the man himself. Crude beginnings, gradual improvements, constant repairs, and a stubborn refusal to give up. Dirt wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. It reminded every cabin dweller where they stood in the grand order of things, between the raw ground beneath and the endless sky above, clinging to survival in a wooden box. And when a mountain man stretched out by his fire, sore muscles sinking into a bed of hides on a dirt-packed floor, he didn't curse it. Not really, because that floor, however humble, however cold, meant he had walls around him, a roof above him, and a fire beside him. It meant he had beaten the wilderness for another day. The dirt floor might have been rough, but it was proof of progress, and in the frontier, progress was the only luxury that mattered. Once the walls were stacked high, the gaps chinked with mud and moss, the roof raised against the storms, and even the dirt floor tamped into some version of livable, a cabin still wasn't finished. You could survive inside it, sure, but survival is not the same as living. Every man who walked into his dark little log box eventually faced the next question. How do you actually get in and out of this thing without climbing through smoke holes or squeezing between logs? That's when doors and windows entered the story. They seem obvious to us now, but on the frontier, cutting holes in your hard-earned walls was one of the riskiest, most nerve-wracking choices a builder had to make. A cabin wall was strength. Every log stacked was muscle against storms, predators, and bitter winds. The moment you hacked a doorway into that wall, you introduced weakness. A bad door meant drafts, leaks, or even collapse if you cut too much. That's why mountain men planned carefully before carving out their entrances. The doorway was usually small, narrow enough to preserve as much wall strength as possible, often no higher than the builder's shoulders. Crawling in and out wasn't comfortable, but comfort mattered less than security. A small door kept heat inside, kept wolves out, and forced anyone entering to stoop, a handy detail if you were worried about unwelcome visitors carrying weapons. Building the actual door was a whole other challenge. With no hardware store to run to, mountain men fashioned doors from split logs or heavy planks hewn with axes and adzes. These were lashed together with wooden pegs or rawhide thongs, sometimes strengthened with cross braces to keep them from sagging. Hinges were carved from wood, or, if a man was lucky, hammered from scraps of iron scavenged from trading posts. Some doors swung on greased wooden pins jammed into sockets in the frame. They creaked, sagged, and warped, but they worked. In desperate cases, a simple hide flap served as a door, lightweight, drafty, but at least something to cover the hole. The lock was usually nothing more than a wooden bar slid into brackets across the inside. Against animals, it worked fine. Bears weren't great at lock-picking. Against humans, well, if someone wanted in badly enough, they'd find a way. But the door still mattered symbolically. It was the barrier between wilderness and home, the single point where a man controlled who entered his space. Closing a solid wooden door at night, even if it groaned on its hinges and rattled in the wind, brought a peace of mind that raw walls alone couldn't give. Windows were trickier still. Every mountain man dreamed of light flooding into his cabin, of being able to see the forest without opening the door. But cutting holes for windows was like inviting misery inside. Glass was a rare treasure, hauled over long distances and traded at outrageous prices. Most mountain men didn't have it. Instead, windows were crude openings cut between logs, small to conserve strength, covered with oiled animal hides or thin sheets of greased paper that let in light while blocking at least some wind. These coverings weren't clear. They turned the outside world into a blur of shadows and colors. Still, they softened the gloom inside, kept the cabin from feeling like a coffin. Shutters were common solutions. A window hole could be closed with a hinged plank shutter, barred tight at night or in storms. During the day, it swung open to let in fresh air and light. Of course, open windows let in bugs, smoke, and curious critters. More than one mountain man woke to find squirrels darting inside through a forgotten shutter, or birds swooping in to steal scraps. But in the constant half-dark of a windowless cabin, even these annoyances seemed worth the trade. Doors and windows also shaped daily life inside. A poorly placed door funneled icy wind straight across the cabin, making it impossible to stay warm. A well-placed one created a draft that pulled smoke upward into the chimney, keeping the air breathable. Windows provided not just light, but sanity. Imagine spending months snowed in, trapped in a one-room box, with no way to see the outside except through cracks. A window, however crude, was a lifeline, a reminder that there was still a world beyond the smoke and shadows. The craft of fitting doors and windows was delicate. Logs had to be cut clean, frames fitted snug, every edge sealed with moss and clay to keep drafts from slicing through. Mistakes couldn't be undone. If you cut the hole too big, you weakened the wall forever. If you cut it crooked, the door jammed constantly. A mountain man's patience was tested here more than anywhere else. Swinging an axe at a tree was straightforward. Hit it enough, it falls. Carving a square doorway into a round log wall took precision, vision, and no small amount of stubbornness. Stories circulated about doors that sagged so badly they had to be lifted back into place every night, or windows so draughty they whistled like flutes in the wind. But there were also stories of cabins with doors fitted so perfectly they swung smooth for years, windows so clever they caught light without leaking warmth. These stories became reputations. A man's cabin reflected his skill, and doors and windows were the clearest evidence. Anyone could stack logs. Not everyone could shape openings that lasted. Symbolically, the first time a door swung shut was a milestone. Until then, the cabin was just an open shell, exposed no matter how tall the walls or how thick the roof. With a door in place, it became a fortress. You could close out the wilderness, however briefly, and claim the space as truly yours. The moment you barred the door against the night was the moment the cabin transformed from structure to home. Windows added their own symbolism. They were fragile, vulnerable points, but they also brought light and hope. Even a small hide-covered window broke the monotony of dark walls, reminding mountain men that survival wasn't only about enduring. It was about finding slivers of comfort where you could. The outside world filtered in, softened, tamed for just a moment. Doors and windows weren't just practical, they were psychological. They reminded the cabin's builder that he wasn't merely enduring in the wilderness, he was shaping it, bending it, making it livable. Each door carved, each shutter hung, was an act of claiming space, of drawing a line between chaos outside and order inside. And when storms raged, snow drifted, or wolves prowled, the sight of a closed door and shuttered window gave a mountain man something priceless, the sense that he was safe. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not permanently, but safe enough to sleep, to dream, to gather strength for another day of battling the unforgiving land. When the last log was notched, the gaps chinked with moss and mud, the roof stacked against snow, the chimney smoking, and the door swinging creakily on its wooden hinge, a cabin still wasn't finished. Because once you stepped inside, you had to figure out how to actually live in the thing. Interior life in a mountain man's cabin wasn't about comfort the way we think of it today. There were no cozy rugs, no upholstered chairs, no polished shelves lined with knickknacks. It was about function, survival, and making the inside of a crude wooden box serve as bedroom, kitchen, workshop, storage shed, and fortress all at once. The first thing you noticed when you stepped inside was the darkness. Cabins were small, often one room, sometimes just a few paces across, and windows, if they existed at all, were tiny and covered with oiled hides or shutters. Smoke stained the logs, drifting lazily even with a chimney pulling it upward. Shadows lurked in the corners, broken only by firelight flickering across rough walls. For a man who'd spent weeks under open sky, the inside of a cabin felt like entering a cave. But unlike a cave, this one was yours. That made all the difference. The centerpiece of interior life was the fireplace. It was both heart and hazard, the source of heat, light, and cooked meals. The hearth was usually the busiest spot in the room, piled with firewood, iron pots if the builder had them, maybe a spit for roasting meat. Skins stretched nearby to dry, tools leaned against the stones, and bedding was often arranged close enough to soak up warmth without catching stray sparks. Nights were spent facing the fire, backs pressed to the cold log walls, hands stretched toward the flames. The glow defined the rhythm of evenings, shaping every sound and shadow inside. Furniture was minimal, usually built from whatever scraps of timber were left after construction. A bed might be nothing more than a raised platform of logs, covered with pine boughs, straw, and animal hides. Some cabins had bunks built into corners, stacked for space, each layered with furs to hold off the chill. Tables were rough planks balanced on stumps, benches hammered together from split logs. Everything was crude, heavy, and practical, designed to last, not impress. Mountain men weren't carpenters by choice, but survival forced their hands. If you wanted somewhere to sit that wasn't the muddy floor, you figured out how to fashion it from wood and sweat. Storage was another challenge. Food needed to stay safe from rodents and bears. Meat was hung from rafters, salted or smoked above the fire. Dried roots and berries were stuffed into sacks or tucked into pits dug in the floor. Pelts, the lifeblood of a trapper's trade, were stretched on frames or piled neatly in corners, giving cabins the permanent smell of fur and musk. Tools leaned against walls, rifles hung within arm's reach, powder horns stored in the driest spots possible. Every inch of space mattered. The cabin interior was less about comfort and more about strategy, arranging things so you could reach what you needed fast, because fumbling in the dark for tinder or ammunition could cost your life. The air inside was a cocktail of scents. Smoke from the chimney mingled with the musky odor of furs, the sour tang of damp hides, the iron bite of sweat, and the earthy reek of the dirt floor. Add in cooking smells, meat sizzling, stews bubbling, bones crackling in flames, and you had an atmosphere that clung to clothes and hair. Visitors to a mountain man's cabin often joked you could smell it before you saw it. But to the man inside, those smells meant life. Smoke meant warmth, food meant survival, furs meant trade, and sweat meant work well done. Lighting came almost entirely from the fire. Candles were rare luxuries, often traded for at posts and used sparingly if at all. Sometimes pine knots, rich in resin, were burned as torches, hissing and spitting sparks while throwing off bright but smoky light. On moonlit nights, slivers of pale glow sneaked through shutters or cracks in the walls. But for the most part, cabin interiors were dim and shadowy. Men adjusted, their eyes growing used to gloom, their lives ruled by daylight hours and firelight nights. The concept of bright indoor living didn't exist. The cabin was a cave with a flame, and that was enough. Noise inside was a constant reminder of survival. Fire popped and hissed, wind moaned through cracks, and the roof creaked under snow. Trapped animals sometimes squeaked from cages, while stored pelts rustled as mice dared to explore. The sounds of chopping wood, sharpening tools, or boiling stews filled the long days. At night, silence settled heavy, broken only by the lonely howl of wolves outside and the occasional shift of logs as the cabin settled in its foundation. To modern ears, it would seem unbearably quiet. To mountain men, it was normal, even comforting, proof that the cabin was holding, that the world outside was shut out. Socially, the interior of a cabin could shift dramatically. For a lone trapper, it was solitude incarnate, a place of muttering conversations with himself, of counting pelts, of staring at flames for hours. For families or groups, it became cramped chaos. Children slept on piles of hides, women cooked and mended, men repaired traps or weapons, everyone stumbling over each other in a space barely big enough for a table and a hearth. Privacy didn't exist, but community made the walls feel less suffocating. Laughter, songs and arguments echoed off the logs just as often as silence did. Cabin interiors also reflected creativity. With no stores, mountain men improvised decorations and comforts. Antlers hung on walls as racks, feathers braided into charms, shells or beads strung as keepsakes. Carvings etched into logs showed boredom and artistry, initials and symbols pressed into rough wood. Some cabins displayed trophies, wolf pelts, bear claws, even skulls, signs of victories over the wilderness. Others were bare, stripped of anything unnecessary, as stark as the men who lived inside them. But the interior of a cabin wasn't just about function or decoration. It was about psychology. The wilderness outside was endless, cold, and merciless. Inside, even in its smoky gloom, the cabin was human territory. It was the only place where a man could relax, however briefly, without eyes scanning the trees for predators or hands tightening on an axe at every sound. The firelight, the walls, the crude furniture, they were reminders that he had carved out a bubble of control in a land that wanted him dead. That bubble, however small, kept men sane. Maintenance was constant. Logs inside warped as they dried, dropping bark flakes onto the floor. Chinking crumbled, letting in drafts that forced more mud and moss into cracks. Fireplaces smoked, blackening walls. Dirt floors grew uneven, needing tamping. Cabins aged quickly, and so did their interiors. But every repair, every smear of fresh clay, every new layer of straw on the floor was an act of resilience. Life inside wasn't about perfection, it was about persistence. So what was interior life in a mountain man's cabin really like? Dark, smoky, damp, cramped, and smelly, and yet strangely comforting. It wasn't luxury, but it was survival shaped into four walls. It was a man lying on a pile of hides, listening to the fire crackle, while snow hammered the roof. It was a family pressed together, sharing warmth and laughter despite hunger. It was a place of grit, of improvisation, of making the wilderness bend just enough to let humans endure another season. And when a mountain man shut his rough-hewn door at night, barred it with a wooden latch, and stretched out in his smoky, dimly lit cabin, he didn't dream of palaces or polished floors. He dreamed of making it through the winter, of pelts to trade, of fires that burned hot. The cabin interior wasn't about beauty, it was about survival. And in its rough, smoky way, it gave exactly what was needed, a space where life could hold on, no matter how harsh the wilderness outside became. By the time a mountain man finished his walls, sealed the gaps, raised the roof, built a chimney, and packed the floor into something that wouldn't swallow his boots, he was left with an empty wooden box. Technically, that was survival. 4 walls and fire to keep out the cold. But humans are stubborn creatures. Even in the wilderness, men craved more than bare dirt and log walls. They wanted places to sit, surfaces to work, racks to store food, and platforms to sleep on that didn't leave them waking up damp and stiff from the floor. Furnishing from scratch wasn't about luxury. It was about sanity and survival, about bending the raw wood of the forest into the shapes of daily life. Furniture started simple. Beds. No one wanted to collapse onto cold dirt after swinging an axe all day. Beds weren't mattresses stuffed with feathers. They were crude frames built from split logs or poles. A common setup was a raised platform in one corner, logs laid parallel with crosspieces lashed or pegged together, topped with pine boughs or straw. On top of that came animal hides, furs from beaver, elk, or buffalo, whatever the man could trap. Softness was relative, but even a lumpy, scratchy pile of hides was better than the damp earth. In families' cabins, bunks might be built along the walls, stacked high like shelves, children on the upper planks, parents below. Beds became not just sleeping spots, but storage, with gear shoved beneath and food hung above to stay out of reach of critters. Next came seating. After a day of chopping, hauling and scraping, sitting on the floor by the fire lost its appeal quickly. Benches were the go-to solution. A split log, flat side up, with legs pegged into it, became a crude seat. Sometimes stumps dragged inside served the same purpose, rough but functional. In cabins where time allowed, actual chairs were carved, though they were heavy and awkward. No one built a rocking chair on the frontier unless they were either exceptionally skilled or exceptionally bored. For most mountain men, a bench or stool was plenty, a spot to rest sore legs and eat a meal without kneeling in the dirt. Tables were equally crude but vital. A flat surface meant a place to prepare food, clean rifles, skin animals, or play cards during long nights. Tables were made from planks if a man had the tools and patience to split them, otherwise from whole slabs of log balanced on stumps. They wobbled, creaked, and tilted, but they did the job. In family cabins, tables became the center of life, meals eaten together, sewing done by firelight, tools mended late into the night. In lone trappers' cabins, tables often doubled as butcher blocks, scarred by knives and stained with blood. Whatever their shape, they were the one piece of furniture almost every cabin eventually had. Storage was a constant struggle. Cabins filled up fast with pelts, tools, food, and firewood. Shelves were carved into walls, boards nailed or pegged across notches in logs. Pegs whittled from branches stuck out of the walls, holding hats, coats, or rifles. Meat hung from rafters in smoky curls, drying above the fireplace. Powder horns, bags of shot, and knives were stored high and dry, safe from dampness and curious animals. Even baskets or boxes woven from willow or bark found places inside. A well-furnished cabin wasn't measured by its comfort, but by its efficiency. Every object had a place, every space had a use, because clutter in a one-room cabin wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. Trip over a stray log in the dark, and you might fall into the fire. Improvisation was the hallmark of furnishing from scratch. A mountain man's knife carved not just notches in logs, but spoons, ladles, bowls, and even mugs. Bark and gourds became containers, hides became rugs or makeshift curtains, antlers became racks for tools. A skilled trapper might carve decorative handles on his spoons, or shape a stool with surprising grace, but even the roughest attempts carried pride. Every object inside the cabin was proof of survival skills, made not bought, created under pressure and necessity. Lighting was another form of furnishing. Candles were rare. So many cabins relied on grease lamps, small bowls filled with animal fat, with twisted cloth wicks that burned with smoky, flickering light. They blackened walls, filled the air with a sour smell, but they allowed reading, sewing, or carving after the fire dimmed. These lamps, along with firelight, shaped the mood inside, casting shadows that turned every cabin into a theater of flickering flame. Over time, some cabins became almost comfortable. Puncheon floors smoothed underfoot, shelves lined the walls, bunks were layered with thick hides, tables bore the marks of countless meals. Cabins grew character, shaped not just by necessity, but by the personalities of their builders. One man might carve antlers into hooks, another might hang charms from rafters, another might fashion crude curtains from hide to keep drafts away from his bed. What began as a box of logs slowly became a home, not through purchases, but through persistence and creativity. Visitors noticed these interiors. A cabin with no furniture felt barren, like a prison. One with benches, bunks, and shelves felt alive, like a true dwelling. Stories tell of travelers grateful to collapse onto even the hardest wooden bench after weeks in the open, or marveling at cabins with surprising touches of comfort. Pillows stuffed with moss, carved wooden cups, even rugs of woven grasses. Furnishings were not just practical, they were statements. They said, "I've made this space mine. I've bent the wilderness to my needs." Of course, not every attempt was graceful. Benches collapsed under weight, tables wobbled until soup spilled, bunks sagged until sleepers rolled onto the floor. But each failure taught lessons, and repairs turned crude attempts into sturdier designs. The interior of a cabin evolved constantly, just as the men inside did. With every season, more shelves appeared, more hooks lined the walls, More hides softened the bunks. Survival drove creativity, and creativity turned cabins into homes. So what did furnishing from scratch really look like? It looked like stumps for stools, slabs for tables, straw for bedding. It looked like smoke-stained rafters hung with meat and pelts. It looked like shelves carved into logs, lamps flickering weakly in corners, and benches polished smooth by weary bodies. It looked like life pared down to its essentials, reshaped by necessity, yet still carrying the stubborn human desire to carve comfort from chaos. And when a mountain man stretched out on his crude bed, head resting on a sack of clothes instead of a pillow, firelight dancing across the table he'd hacked together with his axe, he felt something powerful. He felt for a moment, not just like a survivor, but like a king of his own small wooden castle. Furnishing from scratch didn't make the cabin beautiful. It made it livable. And in the wilderness, livable was everything. Once a cabin stood with walls stacked high, a roof holding against storms, a chimney puffing smoke, and crude furniture inside, the real question pressed hard. Could it survive winter? Because on the frontier, winter wasn't just a season. It was an enemy, creeping down from the mountains with fangs of ice and claws of snow. For mountain men, winter-proofing was the line between life and death. You could survive a leaky roof in summer or drafty walls in spring. But in January, when snow piled waist-high and winds howled like banshees, every crack, every weakness, every forgotten chore came back with a vengeance. So before the first frost, mountain men turned their cabins into fortresses, not of stone or iron, but of wood, mud, hides, and endless human stubbornness. The first step was sealing. Even the best chinking cracked as logs dried and shifted. Moss shrank, clay pulled away, and suddenly drafts slipped in like invisible knives. Mountain men crouched along every seam, jamming fresh moss into gaps, smearing clay thick, repacking where the summer's heat had undone their work. They tested with bare hands, feeling for the cold whisper of air against their skin. If they missed even one gap, they'd feel it in the dead of night, frost creeping across their blankets. Chinking wasn't glamorous, but re-chinking before winter was as important as chopping firewood or stocking food. Next came insulation, not the rolled pink fluff of modern attics, but whatever nature offered. Animal hides were hung along the inside walls, adding a layer of warmth and blocking drafts. In especially cold regions, cabins were banked with snow itself, shoveled high against the outer walls to create a frozen barrier that actually insulated. Grass, straw, and brush piled along the cabin's base added another layer of defense, keeping the wind from finding its way inside. Windows, already crude, were sealed tighter with extra hides, boards, or even thick ice sheets in some cases. Light dimmed, but survival mattered more than sunshine. Firewood was the next obsession. A winter-proof cabin without wood was a coffin. Mountain men cut cords of logs, stacking them high against walls or under lean-tos, enough to last months of burning day and night. Greenwood wouldn't do. It smoked and sputtered, filling the cabin with choking fumes. Only seasoned wood, cut and dried earlier, burned hot and clean enough to keep the hearth going. Men often measured their chances of survival by their woodpile. Too small, and they knew hunger and frost would claim them. Big enough, and they felt like kings, their fortress fueled by the forest itself. Roof-proofing came next. Snow weighed heavy, bending beams and threatening collapse. A weak roof might sag and dump snow through the ceiling in the middle of a storm. Mountain men inspected every log, tightened lashings, patched bark shingles, and reinforced beams with extra poles. Some even smeared mud or clay between shakes to block leaks and add strength. When the first storm came, they listened anxiously for creaks above, praying their roofs would hold. A roof wasn't just protection from rain, it was the shield against crushing tons of snow. Floors had to be prepared too. Dirt floors turned icy, sucking warmth from boots and bones. Some mountain men laid extra straw, others raised their beds higher, away from the cold earth. In rare cases, puncheon floors were added just before winter, logs split and flattened into crude planks to lift the living space above the damp. Fires burned day and night, but the floor always betrayed the truth. The earth never stopped trying to pull heat away. Winter-proofing also meant food storage. No matter how warm the cabin, survival failed without calories. Meat was smoked above the fire, fish dried on racks, berries preserved in whatever containers a man could fashion. Root vegetables were buried in pits dug into the floor, insulated by earth to keep them from freezing. Game hung in the rafters, slowly curing in smoke. Every shelf, peg, and sack was stuffed with something edible, because once the snow fell deep, hunting trips turned deadly. A stocked cabin was a safe cabin. An empty one was a death trap disguised as shelter. Psychologically, winter-proofing was its own battle. Every patch of mud pressed into cracks, every log stacked for firewood, every hide nailed to the wall was a reminder of the season coming fast. Men muttered to themselves as they worked, knowing that one mistake could mean frostbite, starvation, or worse. But they also felt a grim pride. Each improvement was an act of defiance against the cold. Each layer of moss, each log in the woodpile, was like raising a middle finger to winter itself. And still, even the best prepared cabin was never perfect. Smoke leaked, drafts found their way in, snow pushed against doors until they jammed, trapping men inside. Ice formed on the inside of walls, frost creeping over sleeping hides. Fires burned low in the night, forcing men to stumble half asleep to toss on more wood. Cabin interiors grew damp with steam from cooking, then froze hard when flames died. Winter-proofing wasn't about creating perfection. It was about buying time, about making the cabin hold together just long enough to see spring again. Stories tell of mountain men who neglected winter-proofing, too confident or too tired to bother. Their cabins became death traps. Chimneys clogged with ice, walls rattled with drafts, firewood ran out by February. Some abandoned their homes entirely, fleeing south or downhill in search of mercy. Others didn't make it at all, their cabins found in spring, doors buried in snow, walls tilted inward, skeletons curled on beds of straw. The lesson was repeated again and again. Winter respected no excuses. Prepare or perish. But for those who did it right, winter-proofing turned the cabin into something close to miraculous. Snowstorms raged outside, piling against walls, while inside, firelight flickered warm across hides and shelves. Wolves howled in the distance, their cries muted by thickened walls. Winds screamed at the roof, but beams held firm. Families huddled together, eating smoked meat and telling stories, while lone trappers leaned back with pipes, watching smoke curl into the chimney, grateful for every patch of mud and every stick of firewood they'd stacked. Winter-proofing was more than survival. It was victory. It was the frontier equivalent of armor, a man's defense against the deadliest enemy the mountains had to offer. And when spring finally came, when snow melted from the roof and doors swung free again, mountain men stepped outside, weary but alive, knowing their cabin had held. Every smear of clay, every cord of wood, every nailed hide had been worth it. They had beaten winter, and in the mountains, that was the ultimate triumph. Not every mountain man faced the wilderness the same way. Some were lone wolves, stubbornly determined to prove they could carve a home out of the trees without another soul's help. Others leaned on the old traditions of barn raisings and community builds, where many hands made the impossible merely exhausting instead of suicidal. The choice between building alone or building together was more than a matter of preference. It was a survival strategy, and it shaped the very cabins that rose in forests, valleys, and high mountain meadows. For the lone wolf, every step of building a cabin was multiplied in difficulty. Felling trees became a war fought without allies, each giant log dragged inch by inch with ropes, leverage, and pure willpower. Lifting beams into place turned into feats of engineering, ramps and pulleys rigged with nothing but rawhide, patience, and stubbornness. Stacking walls without another pair of hands meant hours wasted prying logs into place, cursing as they rolled back down. Raising a roof alone wasn't just hard, it was dangerous. One slip, one beam crashing the wrong way, and a lone wolf could be crushed with no one to dig him out. Lone builders knew it too. That's why their cabins often ended up smaller, simpler, less polished. When it was just you versus the wilderness, practicality mattered more than pride. Yet some men preferred it that way. Isolation was freedom. A cabin built by one man was proof of independence, a statement carved in wood and sweat. Lone wolves often scoffed at neighbors, muttering that too many voices led to wasted time and sloppy shortcuts. If their walls leaned, they leaned because one man fought gravity alone. If their roof leaked, it leaked because no one was there to lend a hand. Every flaw was theirs, but so was every triumph. Solitude carved cabins as much as axes did. On the other hand, community builds were like frontier festivals, half survival strategy and half social event. When families or settlements decided to raise a cabin, neighbors came from miles around. Dozens of men swarmed the site, axes biting into trees, saws singing, laughter mixing with grunts. Logs that would take one man a day to drag were lifted and carried by 10 in minutes. Walls rose fast, corners locked tight, beams lifted skyward with cheers instead of curses. A cabin that might take a lone wolf weeks or months could stand in a matter of days with enough hands. These builds weren't just practical, they were bonding. Families brought food, women and children fetched water or packed moss for chinking, old men supervised with stories and advice. What might have been a back-breaking ordeal became a community gathering, a barn raising with logs instead of planks. At night, the group feasted, swapping tales while the new cabin's owner basked in gratitude and pride. The cabin wasn't just his, it was a testament to the strength of the group. Community-built cabins often looked sturdier, straighter, and more polished. Many hands meant more skill, more tools, more experience shared. Mistakes were caught early, beams adjusted properly, walls stacked evenly. These cabins stood longer, endured harsher winters, and served as centers of settlement life. But they also lacked some of the raw individuality of lone wolf builds. They were symbols of cooperation, not defiance, shaped as much by group tradition as personal stubbornness. The contrast between lone wolves and community builds revealed the deeper divide in frontier survival. Solitude offered independence but demanded brutal endurance. Community offered speed and strength but required compromise. Mountain men lived somewhere along that spectrum, some drifting between, building alone when traveling trap lines, but joining neighbors when larger shelters were needed. Psychologically, the difference was stark. Lone wolves often fell into long silences, their cabins filled with muttered self-talk, fire crackles, and the scrape of tools. Isolation carved into their minds as deeply as axes carved logs. Some thrived on it, proud of their solitude. Others grew restless, haunted by the absence of voices. In contrast, cabins built by communities often rang with laughter, conversation, and the bustle of families. They were messy, noisy, crowded, but also full of warmth and companionship. Both paths carried risks. Lone wolves could die unnoticed, their cabins found months later as ruins. Community cabins could collapse into chaos if disputes arose, neighbors turning against each other over land, food, or pride. But whichever path a man chose, the cabin remained the measure of his survival. Did he build it alone, scarred by effort but proud of independence? Or did he raise it with many hands, strengthened by unity, but bound to the group? Stories survive of both extremes. Tales of trappers who built cabins alone so small they were barely bigger than coffins, yet endured blizzards within them. Tales of settlements where dozens of men raised a 2-room cabin in a single day, singing as they worked. Tales of lone wolves whose crooked cabins leaned so badly they seemed ready to fall, yet still stood years later. Tales of community builds that became legendary, where cabins turned into taverns, trading posts, or even churches, rising from the labor of many. In the end, community builds and lone wolves weren't rivals. They were different answers to the same brutal question: how do you survive the wilderness? Some men chose silence and struggle, their cabins monuments to grit. Others chose laughter and unity, their cabins monuments to cooperation. Both paths left cabins behind, rough, smoky, drafty, and alive with stories. And whether raised by one man's hands or by 100, every cabin that stood through a mountain winter was proof of the same truth. Survival wasn't easy, but with sweat, willpower, and stubborn wood, it was possible. Lone or together, these cabins whispered the same victory against the cold, the wild, and the endless emptiness of the frontier. When the last log was stacked, the roof patched against snow, the chimney puffing steady smoke, and the door barred against the night, a mountain man could finally stand back, aching, blistered, and proud. He had taken raw forest and bent it into a home. But the story of log cabins didn't end with one man and his shelter in the mountains. The true legacy of these cabins stretched far beyond their smoky interiors, their creaking puncheon floors, and their draft-stuffed walls. They became symbols, myths, and memories, proof that survival was possible in places where nature had no interest in letting humans linger. For the mountain men themselves, the cabins were lifelines. Each one was a fortress of stubbornness against cold and hunger, a place to stack pelts, cook game, and dry boots by firelight. The legacy they carried in the moment was simple. You could not last a winter without one. A tent or lean-to might do for summer, but when the snows fell, you needed walls. Cabins kept men alive, and life on the frontier left no room for poetry about it. Yet in hindsight, those rough shelters became more than survival huts. They became symbols of human endurance, wooden monuments to grit, sweat, and ingenuity. The legacy grew with settlers. As families pushed westward, log cabins multiplied. What began as mountain men's hideouts became homesteads, schools, even churches. Cabins were the first mark of permanence in new lands, rough sketches of civilization drawn in logs and mud. Towns grew out of clusters of cabins, communities sprouting from smoky valleys. To settlers, the cabin was both necessity and statement. It said, "We are here to stay, no matter how wild the wilderness." Culturally, the log cabin became a legend. Politicians in later centuries, from Abraham Lincoln to William Henry Harrison, wrapped themselves in the image of the humble log cabin to prove their toughness, their connection to the people. Never mind whether they actually split rails or slept on dirt floors, the symbol mattered more than the truth. The log cabin became shorthand for resilience, honesty, and the idea that greatness could rise from the simplest beginnings. It was mythologized into American identity, a reminder that every city was once a clearing in the woods with a single smoky hut at its center. But the legacy wasn't just symbolic. The techniques mountain men used, The notching of logs, the chinking of moss, the patience of laying sills shaped construction for generations. Even as sawmills grew, even as bricks and boards replaced rough timber, echoes of the log cabin lingered. Some cabins lasted decades, passed down, expanded, patched, and turned from survival boxes into family homes. Others collapsed into ruins, their hearthstones the only markers left in fields. Yet each ruin whispered the same story. Someone fought to live here, and for a time, they won. The legacy also lives in the sheer romance of it all. Even today, people dream of cabins in the woods, cozy retreats with fire crackling, snow drifting outside, silence pressing in. The modern cabin, with its polished wood and picture windows, is a sanitized descendant of the mountain man's hut, but the longing is the same. It is the dream of refuge, of shutting the world out and surviving with nothing but your own hands and the warmth of firelight. Every Airbnb cabin and lakeside retreat owes its charm to the ghosts of men who built with axes, sweat, and desperation. Of course, the reality was harsher. The legacy of cabins includes frostbitten fingers, smoke-blackened lungs, and nights when snow drifted through chinking no matter how much mud you stuffed in. Families huddled together against drafts, food ran short, and roofs leaked. Cabins weren't romantic in their time. They were grueling, cold, and endlessly demanding. But survival itself is a kind of romance when you look back far enough. The discomfort fades in memory, and what remains is the pride. They lived here, they endured, they left something standing when the wilderness tried to wipe them out. Archaeologists and historians still find those legacies today. Hearthstones buried in soil, rotten log outlines, rusted hinges, shards of clay daubing hardened into lumps. Each fragment is a clue to lives lived hard, but lived nonetheless. The cabins may have crumbled, but the story of them endures in every ruin, every diary, every folk song that praises the log walls that held back the storm. The legacy even reaches into language. Log cabin no longer means just a hut of wood. It means humility, toughness, starting from nothing. It means an origin story, whether for a person, a town, or even a nation. When people say, from log cabin to White House, they are speaking not just of Lincoln, but of the myth that cabins created, that greatness grows out of struggle, that shelter carved from the wild can give birth to dreams bigger than its smoky walls. For mountain men, the legacy was more personal. A cabin meant survival, but it also meant belonging. Many wandered the frontier endlessly, chasing furs or solitude, but wherever they built a cabin, they left a mark. Some returned year after year to the same smoky shelter, patching the roof, rechinking the walls, calling it home in a world where home was rare. Others abandoned cabins, leaving them for strangers to find, each new occupant layering their own story on top of the last. Cabins became shared legacies, passed from hand to hand, log to log, fire to fire. In the end, the legacy of log cabins is both harsh and hopeful. They were places of cold, smoke, and endless labor, yet they were also places of survival, laughter, and life. They stand as reminders that humans can take the rawest materials, trees, mud, stone, and willpower, and shape them into safety. They are symbols of endurance, of beginnings, of stubbornness carved into wood. And when you picture a mountain man, axe in hand, standing outside his smoky, crooked, mud-chinked cabin with snow piled high against the walls, you're looking at more than a hut. You're looking at a story that has survived centuries. You're looking at the legacy of log cabins, proof that even in the wildest wilderness, humans found a way to build, to endure, and to leave behind more than footprints in the snow.